Clara Whitmore pressed herself flat against the wall of the stagecoach the moment it rolled to a stop. Not from exhaustion, not from the long weeks of travel, but because the man standing on that dusty Montana street was wearing the exact same coat as the man she had fled. Her breath stopped. Her fingers went white around the handle of her suitcase. Not here. Please God, not here. She had come over 1,000 miles. She had given up everything. And if Richard Vale had found her already, then there was nowhere left in this world she could run. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end, because this story is going to take you somewhere you never expected. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to see just how far this story has traveled. Montana Territory, summer 1885. The stagecoach had been rolling for 3 days straight through heat and dust, and the kind of silence that makes a person feel like the rest of the world has forgotten they exist. Clara Whitmore had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch the entire journey. Not because the road was rough, though it was. Not because the other passengers snored, though they did. But because every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face. Richard Vale, 43 years old. A Boston shipping merchant with soft hands and cold eyes, and a smile that looked perfectly pleasant until you found yourself alone with it. Clara was 25, and she had made the mistake of saying no to him. She had said no quietly at first, politely, the way a well-raised woman from a respectable but struggling family was expected to say things with apology wrapped around every word, as though her refusal was the problem and not the question itself. Richard had smiled through her first refusal. He had smiled through her second. It was on the third that the smile disappeared. "You don't understand what I'm offering you," he had told her, standing in the front parlor of her family's townhouse while her mother sat in the corner pretending not to hear. "Your father's debts don't simply vanish because you prefer to wait for something better. There is nothing better coming for a woman like you. I am the better thing." Clara had stood very still. She had not argued, had not cried, had not thrown the vase sitting on the mantelpiece at his perfectly groomed head, though the thought had occurred to her. She had simply looked at him and understood for the first time with absolute clarity that this man did not see her as a person. She was a transaction, and her family, her mother's nervous hands, her father's hollow eyes, the quiet shame that had lived in their house since the shipping company failed, her family was prepared to complete that transaction, whether she agreed or not. 2 weeks later, when she had overheard her father on the telephone confirming a date with Richard's attorney, Clara had gone upstairs, packed a single leather suitcase, and walked out the back door before sunrise. She had taken nothing that wasn't already hers. She had left no note, because leaving a note would have told them which direction she was going. The newspaper advertisement had found her 3 days before her escape, folded inside a copy of the Boston Courier someone had left on a bench in the public garden. She hadn't been looking for it. She hadn't been looking for anything except a moment of quiet that didn't feel like borrowed time. Seeking a woman of honest character and willing heart. Ranch life on the Montana frontier. Private accommodations, fair arrangement, no demands beyond good faith. Correspondence welcomed. W. Callahan, Willow Creek, Montana Territory. She had read it 3 times. She wasn't sure what moved her more, the word honest or the phrase no demands. Both of those things felt like water to someone who had been thirsty for a long time. She wrote back the same evening at a writing desk in the back corner of a public library, using the address of a sympathetic friend as her return point. She told W. Callahan her name. She told him she was 25. She told him she was capable of hard work, and that she understood frontier life would be nothing like the city. She did not tell him she was running. She didn't know yet whether she could trust a stranger from Montana with that particular truth. His response came in 11 days, written in a hand that was careful and deliberate. Each letter formed as though the writer had taken time to think before putting it down. Miss Whitmore. Your letter was direct, and I respect that. I won't waste your time with words I don't mean. The ranch is small. The work is real. I am not a man who talks much, but I am a man who keeps his word. If you find the arrangement isn't right for you, I won't hold you to it. You'd have your own room, your own choices. I just figured two people living alone might do better keeping each other company than living apart. W. Callahan. Clara had read that letter sitting on the edge of her friend's settee and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight for months. Your own choices. 3 words. 3 words that Wyatt Callahan probably hadn't thought twice about writing. 3 words that Clara Whitmore had not heard from any man in longer than she could remember. She wrote back the next morning and said yes. Nah. The stagecoach stopped. Clara's hands gripped the suitcase handle before her eyes were fully open. She made herself breathe slowly. Counted to 4 on the inhale. Counted to 4 on the exhale. The technique her old school teacher had taught her years ago, back when the world had been simpler and fear had been smaller things. A thunderstorm, an examination, a disappointed parent. Not a man in an identical coat standing 40 feet away on a frontier main street. She pressed closer to the window and looked again. The man turned. A different face. Older. Heavier in the jaw. Nothing like Richard at all. The breath she had been strangling finally came free. Stop it, she told herself. Stop doing this to yourself. But knowing she was doing it and being able to stop it were 2 completely separate things, and she had discovered months ago that the fear didn't particularly care which one she preferred. She gathered herself, picked up her suitcase, and stepped down from the coach onto the main street of Willow Creek, Montana. The town was smaller than she had imagined. A general store, a telegraph office, a saloon with a painted sign that had faded in the sun until the letters were barely readable. A church at the far end of the street with a fresh coat of white paint that made it look newer than everything around it. People had come to watch the stagecoach arrive. That was what people did in small towns. Any arrival was an event worth watching. Clara felt the weight of their attention land on her like a physical thing, and she had to resist the urge to pull her bonnet lower. She scanned the street. She was looking for a man she had never seen. Tall or short, young or old, kind, or something other she genuinely didn't know. His letters had told her almost nothing about what he looked like, and she hadn't thought to ask because the question that had mattered more was, "What kind of man are you?" And she had been trying to read the answer in between his careful, deliberate sentences. "Miss Whitmore." The voice came from her left, and Clara turned so quickly that she nearly dropped the suitcase. The man standing there was not what she had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but this wasn't it. He was tall, genuinely tall, the kind of tall that made the space around him seem slightly smaller. Wide through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they had done real work for every one of the 36 years he had lived. His hair was dark, and his jaw was rough with several days of not shaving, and beneath the brim of a worn hat were eyes the color of a river in winter, gray-green and steady and calm, in a way that felt almost unusual. He was not holding anything out toward her, not his hand, not her bag. He was standing about 6 feet away, giving her room as though he had already understood something about her that most people needed to be told. "I'm Wyatt Callahan," he said. "You had a long ride." It wasn't a question. It was just something he'd noticed. "I did," Clara said. A beat of silence passed between them, the kind that could have been awkward with someone else but somehow wasn't. "I can take your bag if you want," Wyatt said. "Or I can walk beside you and you can carry it yourself. Either way is fine with me." Clara looked at him. That was an oddly specific thing to say. She couldn't decide yet whether she was grateful for it or unsettled by it. "I'll carry it," she said. He nodded once like that was a perfectly reasonable answer, and turned to indicate the direction of his wagon without another word. Clara followed him. She was watching his hands. She always watched men's hands first now. It was a habit she had developed without deciding to. Hands told you things, whether they were loose and easy or tight with something kept inside, whether they moved toward you or held their distance, whether they wanted something from you before they'd even spoken a word. Wyatt's hands were in his pockets. She wasn't sure what to make of that. The ride to the ranch took about 40 minutes on a road that wound through open land with mountains rising on both sides. Wyatt drove. Clara sat on the bench beside him with her suitcase on her lap because there wasn't anywhere else to put it, and the silence between them was the kind of silence she was still learning to figure out. With Richard, silence had never been silence. It had always been something underneath, a pressure, a weight, a warning that the next word was going to cost her something. This silence felt different. It felt like nothing was required from her. She wasn't sure yet whether that was comforting or simply new. "You said in your letter you'd never been west of Pittsburgh," Wyatt said without looking at her. Not accusatory, just making conversation. "That's right," Clara said. "It's different from what most people picture." "I'm finding that." Another pause. "Is it what you expected?" he asked. Clara considered that question seriously. He seemed like the kind of man who would notice if she said something she didn't mean, and she had spent enough time saying things she didn't mean to last her the rest of her life. "It's bigger," she said finally. "Quieter. I thought I'd feel lonely. But I think I feel—" She searched for the word. "Smaller. In a way that might be good." Wyatt glanced at her from under the brim of his hat. "Yeah," he said. "The mountains do that." And that was all. But it was the first conversation Clara Whitmore had experienced in longer than she could count, where no one was trying to win anything. The ranch appeared around a long bend in the road, and Clara saw it for the first time, a wooden farmhouse, weathered but solid, a barn not far behind it, a split-rail fence enclosing a modest pasture where 2 horses stood in the late afternoon light. It was nothing like Boston. It was nothing like anything she had ever been part of. She felt something complicated move through her. Not regret and not relief, but something between the two that she didn't have a clean name for. Wyatt brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down, then turned to offer her a hand down from the bench. Clara hesitated. Just for half a second. That brief, involuntary freezing that happened in her body before her mind could intervene and remind her that this was not the same man, not the same place, not the same terrible situation. Wyatt noticed. She saw him notice, but he didn't say anything about it, and he didn't pull his hand back either. He just waited, patient and still, the way a person waits when they understand that hurrying would only make things worse. Clara took his hand. His grip was careful, not tight. He steadied her down from the bench and then released her immediately, turning back toward the wagon to collect her suitcase before she had to ask. "I'll show you the house," he said. "You can tell me what you need to change." Clara blinked. "Change?" "It's your house too," he said simply, like it was obvious. "I'm not sentimental about the curtains." For the first time in a very long time, Clara almost smiled. The room he gave her had a door with a real iron lock on it. She noticed it the moment he opened the door to show her in a proper lock with a key sitting in it, and Wyatt removed that key before she'd said a word and placed it in her hand. "Key's yours," he said. "I don't have a copy." Clara stood there looking down at the key in her palm. "Why?" she asked. It came out more plainly than she intended. Wyatt leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, not coming in, respecting the threshold, even when the door was open. "Because some people need to know they can lock a door," he said. "I figured you might be one of them." Clara looked up at him. She looked at him for a long moment. "You don't know anything about me," she said carefully. "No," he agreed. "But I know what a person looks like when they're watching for trouble that isn't there yet. And I know that the best way to help with that is to make sure the trouble can't get in." The key was warm in her hand. She didn't know what to say. She didn't think she needed to say anything. She stepped into the room, and Wyatt pulled the door gently closed behind her. Clara stood in the quiet and breathed. That first night, she did not sleep well. She rarely did anymore. Her body had forgotten the difference between being safe and being somewhere the danger hadn't found her yet. And until she could teach it the difference again, rest was going to be a negotiation rather than something that simply happened. Around 2 a.m, she heard movement in the kitchen below her room. The sound of a kettle being moved. A drawer opening and closing softly. She lay still and listened. Then she got up, wrapped her shawl around herself, and went downstairs. Wyatt was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of something hot, not reading. Not doing anything in particular. Just sitting in the kind of way that suggested he'd been awake long before the kettle. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "Couldn't sleep," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "Rarely do," he said. He nodded toward the stove where the kettle sat. "There's tea if you want it." She poured herself a cup and sat down across from him at the table, because the alternative was going back upstairs to lie in the dark and listen to her own thoughts, and that seemed worse. They sat in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable silence. Just two people who were both awake in the middle of the night, in a house that was learning how to hold more than one person again. "What woke you?" Wyatt asked. He said it quietly, carefully, like he was opening a door and leaving it up to her whether she walked through. Clara turned the cup in her hands. "A habit," she said. He didn't push. She appreciated that more than she expected to. "You lost people," she said eventually. She wasn't sure why she said it. Something in the way he sat alone in his own kitchen at 2 a.m, not surprised to have company, not asking her to explain, suggested a familiarity with loss that you only got from living close to it. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "My wife," he said. 7 years ago, fever, and my son." He paused. He was 2. Clara's chest tightened. "I'm sorry," she said. 7 years is long enough," he said, not dismissing it, just saying what was true. "I don't think it works like that," Clara said quietly. "I don't think time has much to do with it." Wyatt looked at her. "No," he said. "I don't suppose it does." They sat with that for a while. The house was quiet around them. The mountains were dark outside the window, and two strangers who had agreed to share a life they weren't sure how to build, yet sat together in the middle of the night and said true things to each other for the first time, which is sometimes where real things begin. The first week passed in the careful choreography of two people learning each other's rhythms without getting in each other's way. Clara woke early. She had spent months sleeping lightly and rising before dawn, because in her family's house in the final months before she left, being awake before everyone else was the only time that felt entirely her own. She discovered that Wyatt was always already up when she came downstairs. He had coffee made. He never asked if she wanted any. He just had an extra cup set out on the counter, which she chose to interpret as either courtesy or the quiet assumption that she was going to want it, and both of those things seemed fine to her. They divided the work without discussing it. Wyatt handled the horses and the heavier fence repairs, and the parts of the ranch that required his particular knowledge of how the land worked. Clara, who had never done any of this in her life, watched him when he'd let her, and learned faster than he seemed to expect. "You don't have to do that," he told her on the third morning, coming out to find her attempting to fill the water trough with a bucket she could barely carry at full capacity. "I know I don't have to," Clara said, setting the bucket down and rolling her shoulder. "I want to learn." Wyatt watched her for a moment, then went to get a second bucket without a word. They filled it together. He didn't compliment her on being determined or tell her she was doing well. He just worked beside her like she was capable, which was better than the compliment would have been. On the 5th day, she made a mistake. She had been trying to help repair a section of fence on the north side of the pasture. Wyatt had shown her how to set the post, and she had thought she understood, and she had set it wrong. Not dramatically wrong, but wrong enough that it would have caused problems by winter when the ground hardened and the posts needed to hold against pressure. Wyatt spotted it when he came to check her progress. Clara saw his face and felt the old reflexive tightening in her chest, the anticipation of something ugly on its way, the bracing. But he just crouched down beside the post, examined it, and said, "Here's what happened." He showed her. The angle was off. He explained what the angle needed to be, and why and how to test it, and what to watch for when the ground had different moisture levels in different seasons. Then he stood up. "Happens to everybody the first time," he said. "Second time it happens to everybody, I start to get opinionated." It took Clara a full second to realize he was joking. When she laughed, a short, startled, genuine laugh that came out before she had any say in it. Wyatt looked slightly surprised, like the sound was something unexpected, and also something that improved the quality of the afternoon. "I'll get it right the second time," she told him. "I know you will," he said, no doubt in his voice, just a statement of what he believed was true. Clara turned back to the fence post, and this time she paid attention to the angle. On the seventh evening, something shifted. They were sitting on the porch after supper. This had become a habit without either of them deciding it was one, and the sky had gone that particular deep blue that happened for about 20 minutes before full dark, when the color seemed to come from somewhere inside the atmosphere rather than from the sun. Clara said, "I need to tell you something." Wyatt said, "You don't have to tell me anything." "I know," she said. "I want to." He turned to look at her. She had been thinking about this for several days. She had been weighing what he had earned and what she owed him, and what the difference was between those two things. She had decided that she didn't owe him anything. She had also decided that she wanted him to know the truth, not because it would change anything, but because she was tired of carrying it alone, and he was the first person in a long time who had given her reason to believe that the truth wouldn't be used against her. "The man I was supposed to marry," she said. "He wasn't someone I chose. He was someone my father chose because my father needed money, and Richard Vale had money, and that was the entire arrangement." Wyatt listened without moving. "I refused," Clara said. 3 times. And then I heard my father on the telephone agreeing to a date with Richard's attorney, and I understood that my refusal didn't matter anymore. So I left." She stopped. Wyatt said, "That took courage." "It felt like terror," Clara said. "I'm not sure there's always a difference." "There isn't," Wyatt said quietly. "Most of the time, courage is just terror that decided to move anyway." Clara looked at her hands in her lap. "He's not the kind of man who accepts no," she said. "Not from anyone, but especially not from someone he considers his property." She paused. "I don't know if he's looking for me. I think he probably is. He's not someone who likes to lose things he's decided belong to him." The silence after that was different from all the other silences they had shared. This one had weight. "I should have told you before I came," Clara said. "You agreed to a wife, not to someone else's trouble." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're not trouble, Clara. You're a person who left a bad situation and came somewhere she thought might be better. That's not complicated." "It might get complicated," she said, "if he finds out where I am." "Then it gets complicated," Wyatt said. The steadiness in his voice was remarkable, not because it was the absence of worry, but because it was the presence of resolution. "People here know how to deal with complicated." Clara looked at him. "You're not angry," she said. She had expected anger. The rational part of her had known there was a reasonable chance he wouldn't be angry, but the part that had learned to expect it waited for it anyway. "Why would I be angry?" Wyatt said. "You didn't lie to me. You didn't tell me everything, but you hadn't decided yet if you could. Those are different things." Clara studied his face. She was trying to find the underneath part, the thing below the words. That was the real thing. The requirement. The condition. The price. There wasn't one. She didn't entirely know what to do with that. "Thank you," she said finally. "For the room. For the lock. For—" She stopped because the list was longer than she'd expected, and she wasn't sure she had the language for all of it yet. "I'll get it right the second time," he said. It took her a second to recognize her own words coming back to her. When she smiled, this one slower than the one from the fence post, and fuller. Wyatt looked at her like it was something worth remembering. But some things don't wait to be ready. It was 10 days after Clara's arrival on a bright Tuesday morning, when the air smelled like pine, and the horses were moving restlessly in their pasture, for reasons Clara couldn't identify yet, but Wyatt said meant weather was coming. She was in the house folding laundry when she heard the sound of a horse on the road. That wasn't unusual. People occasionally rode past on their way to the far end of the valley. What was unusual was that the horse stopped. Clara's hand slowed on the sheet she was folding. She heard the front gate open. She heard footsteps on the porch. And then a knock. 3 sharp, impatient raps. Not the kind of knock a neighbor made when they were stopping by, but the kind of knock a person made when they expected the door to open immediately. Clara set down the sheet. She walked to the window and moved the curtain just enough to see the porch. The man standing at her front door was wearing a gray coat and a city hat that looked wildly out of place in the Montana dust. She had never seen this man before in her life. But something in the set of his shoulders, the expectation in his posture, the absolute assumption that the door would open, made her stomach turn over in a way she recognized from a long time ago. She went to the back door. Wyatt was coming from the barn. He had heard the knock. He was already moving toward the house with that particular unhurried pace that Clara was beginning to understand didn't mean he wasn't paying attention. It meant he was paying complete attention and hadn't yet decided to change what he was doing about it. She met him at the corner of the house. "Man at the front door," she said quietly. "I saw him ride in," Wyatt said. "I don't know him." "I don't either. But—" She stopped. Wyatt looked at her. "Tell me," he said. Clara took a breath. "He carries himself like someone who works for Richard. Someone Richard would hire. I don't know how to explain that. I just know the posture." Wyatt said nothing for a moment. His eyes moved to the front of the house, and something in his expression shifted not to fear, not to anger, but to the particular focused stillness of a man who has spent years reading situations before they became problems. "Stay here," he said. "I'm not going to stay here," Clara said immediately. Wyatt looked at her. She looked back. "All right," he said. And somehow that was enough. They walked around to the front of the house together. The man at the door introduced himself as James Tilden. He was from Boston, he said. He was a representative of the Vale family. He was conducting a welfare inquiry on behalf of Clara's family, who were deeply concerned about her whereabouts. He smiled when he said the word welfare. It was Richard's smile. Not the same face, but the same construction, the same purpose. Something friendly on the surface, and nothing friendly underneath. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his gaze moved to Clara, with something in it that she recognized as calculation dressed up as concern. "Your family has been extremely worried. Mr. Vale in particular has expressed—" "I'm not a missing person," Clara said. Her voice was steady. It surprised her. It surprised Wyatt too, she thought, though he didn't show it. "No one is suggesting," Tilden began. "I left," Clara said. "I chose to leave. I didn't send a letter because I didn't want to be found, which is also a choice I made on purpose. I'm not missing. I'm exactly where I decided to be." Tilden's smile adjusted. "Your father has concerns." "My father's concerns were made clear to me," Clara said. "They were concerns about his debts, not about me. I understand the difference." Something moved across Tilden's face that wasn't pleasant. "Mr. Vale has asked me to convey that he's willing to overlook the difficulty of the past few months," he said. "He's a generous man. He understands that women sometimes act impulsively." "Get off my property," Wyatt said. Tilden's attention snapped to him. Up until that moment, Wyatt had not said a word. He had stood beside Clara with his hands in his pockets, which Clara now understood was not the posture of a man who wasn't paying attention. It was the posture of a man who was paying complete attention and choosing what to do with it. Now Wyatt looked at James Tilden with the same steady river-water gaze that he had turned on Clara at the stagecoach stop, except that on Tilden it landed differently. "She told you she's here by choice," Wyatt said. "She told you she left on purpose. She told you why. You're not hearing anything she's saying, and that tells me everything I need to know about why you're here. So I'm going to say this once: get off my property and tell whoever sent you that this conversation is finished." Tilden looked between them. "You're making a mistake," he said, to Wyatt, as though Clara had stopped being relevant to the conversation. "I make my own mistakes," Wyatt said. Out there past that gate." The silence lasted for a long, careful moment. Then James Tilden adjusted his hat, walked down the porch steps, mounted his horse, and rode back toward town. Neither Clara nor Wyatt moved until the sound of hooves had completely faded. Then Clara exhaled. It came out longer than she expected, like something had been compressed in her chest for quite some time, and was only now finding room to leave. "He's going to report back," she said. "I know," Wyatt said. "Richard is going to come here himself." "Probably." Clara looked at him. "Does that bother you?" Wyatt thought about that for what seemed like an honest moment. "It means we need to know a few things before he does," he said. "We. Not you." "We." Clara noticed that word with the full weight of it. "What things?" she asked. Wyatt turned and headed back toward the house. "Come inside," he said. "I'm going to need you to tell me everything you know about Richard Vale. Everything. Not what you think I need to know everything. Because if he's coming here, I'd rather understand exactly what we're dealing with." Clara followed him. And as she stepped through the door of the ranch house, with the Montana mountains rising behind her, and the sound of the fading horsemen still in her ears, she realized something she hadn't expected. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't preparing to face something alone. And that, more than the lock on the door, more than the key in her hand, more than any single kindness Wyatt Callahan had offered her in 10 quiet days, was the thing that made her feel like she might actually survive what was coming. The storm wasn't finished with Clara Whitmore. It was only just beginning. And in the days ahead, when Richard Vale himself came riding into Willow Creek with money and lawyers, and a story designed to take everything from her, it would not be the woman who arrived terrified who faced him. It would be someone else entirely. Someone the fear had been building without her knowing. The kitchen table between them held 2 cups of coffee that were going cold, and Clara was talking. She had told Wyatt she would tell him everything, and she meant it. And now that she was doing it, the words came faster than she expected. Not because she had been waiting to say them, but because saying them out loud to someone who was actually listening turned out to be a very different experience from carrying them around inside her head, where they had lived for the past several months, getting heavier every week. She told him about her father's shipping business and the slow, quiet way it had failed, not in a single dramatic collapse, but in a long decline that her father had hidden from the family, until the debts were so large that hiding them became impossible. She told him about Richard Vale, appearing in their lives, the way certain men appeared, not announcing themselves as problems, but arriving as solutions. Smooth, well-dressed, full of reassurance. The kind of man who made you feel like the difficulty you were in was already handled as long as you understood what handling it would cost. He came to dinner 3 times before he said anything directly, Clara said. He was perfectly pleasant. He asked about my interests. He listened when I talked. My mother thought he was wonderful. She paused. I thought something was wrong with me for not feeling the same way. What felt wrong? Wyatt asked. He listened, Clara said. But he never changed anything based on what he heard. He'd ask what I thought about something, and I'd tell him, and he'd nod, and then continue doing exactly what he'd already planned to do. Like asking was the courtesy, and my answer was irrelevant. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. After a while, I realized he wasn't interested in what I thought. He was interested in what I looked like while I was thinking. Wyatt said nothing. He was watching her with that steady attention that she was still learning wasn't waiting for a pause. It was actual listening. The kind where the person on the other side of the table was filing things away, not just waiting for their turn. When he finally proposed, Clara said, he didn't ask me. He told my father, and my father told my mother, and my mother told me. As though I was the last person who needed to be informed. She stopped. I said no. And my father said I would change my mind when I understood the situation better, and Richard said he was willing to be patient. She looked up. He said it the way someone says they'll wait for a horse to tire itself out. Wyatt's jaw tightened. Just slightly. But Clara saw it. I said no again 2 weeks later, she said. This time directly to Richard. He smiled and said, Clara, you're going to hurt my feelings. Like I was being playful, like no was a game I was playing that he found charming. She set down the cup. The third time I said no, the smile didn't come back. He told me I didn't understand what he was offering. He told me my father's debts would follow every member of my family for the rest of their lives if the arrangement didn't go through. He told me that was simply how things worked. He threatened your family, Wyatt said. He stated facts, Clara said. That was how he did it. He never said anything that sounded like a threat. He just described the way things were and let you figure out that you were inside the description. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you know about his business? Clara frowned. His shipping business. Any of it. The shipping, the investments, whatever else he has his hands in. A man like that, the kind of power he has, doesn't come from one place. It comes from a lot of places that don't all look like each other. My father talked about him sometimes, Clara said slowly, before everything collapsed. He mentioned that Richard had interests in land, that he'd been acquiring property in different territories. He made it sound admirable at the time, like Richard was a man who saw the future before other people did. Wyatt looked at her sharply. What territories? I don't know specifically. I wasn't meant to be listening to those conversations. I was meant to be at the other end of the house being agreeable. She caught something in Wyatt's expression. What is it? He was quiet for a moment, that stretched just long enough to make her chest tighten. There's been talk, he said carefully, for the past year or so about land around Willow Creek. Federal land that the railroad wants. The kind of deal that makes certain men very wealthy if they get the deed transfers completed before the territory becomes a state, because once it's a state, the process becomes a great deal more complicated. Clara stared at him. You think Richard has interests here? She said. I think the timing is interesting, Wyatt said. And I think a man with enough money and enough reach to track down a woman who took a stagecoach to Montana without telling anyone where she was going has more information about this part of the world than he'd have if this was only about you. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind was picking up the way Wyatt had said it would. The horses had been right about the weather. He's not just coming to bring me back, Clara said. It wasn't a question. She was thinking it through out loud, and the thinking was arriving somewhere colder than she'd started. He's coming because there's something here he already wants. And I'm a convenient reason. Maybe, Wyatt said. Or maybe you're both things. A man like that can want two things at once, without one of them being less true. Clara sat with that. Then she said, What does he want with the land? That, Wyatt said, is what we need to find out. Shy. The storm arrived that night exactly when the horses said it would, a hard Montana rain that came down sideways and turned the road outside the ranch to mud that held boot prints like memory. Clara lay awake, listening to it hammer the roof above her locked room, and thought about Richard Vale, knowing her general direction, which meant his man Tilden was already in Willow Creek, sleeping at the town's only boarding house, and probably already talking to people. That was how Richard worked. He didn't move directly. He moved sideways, gathering information, building impressions, putting money in the right places before he ever showed his own face. By the time Richard Vale walked into a room, the room had usually already been prepared to receive him favorably. She was up before dawn. Wyatt was already in the kitchen. He looked at her when she came in and said, You didn't sleep. You didn't either, she said. I was thinking. So was I. He handed her a cup of coffee. She took it and sat down and said, What were you thinking about? Ed Garrity? Wyatt said. Who's Ed Garrity? The county land office, Wyatt said. He keeps records of every deed transfer in the county. He's a careful man, honest, which in a land office is rarer than it should be. He's also been worried for the past 6 months about inquiries he's been receiving from lawyers he's never heard of asking about property lines on land that's either federally held or in dispute. Clara set down her cup. How worried? Worried enough to make copies of his records and keep them somewhere that isn't the land office, Wyatt said. which tells you something about how he reads the situation. Can we talk to him? Wyatt looked at her with something in his expression that was the closest thing she'd seen to amusement since she'd arrived. Yes, Clara said without flinching. Unless you have a reason why I shouldn't be there. He thought about it for a genuine half-second. No, he said. Actually, you should be there. You know what questions to ask about how a man like Richard structures his business arrangements. I know what questions to ask about land. Between us, we're more useful than either one alone. Clara nodded once. After breakfast, Wyatt said. And wear something practical. The road after last night is going to be a project. Ed Garrity was a small, precise man in his 60s who kept his office in a state of meticulous order that Clara found both impressive and slightly unnerving. Everything filed. Everything labeled. Nothing out of place. The kind of organization that suggested a man who had spent a long time making sure nothing important could be claimed to be lost. He looked at Wyatt when they came in, and then he looked at Clara, and then he looked at Wyatt again. This is Clara, Wyatt said. She's living out at the ranch. I heard, Garrity said. He said it neutrally, which in a small town was practically a declaration of support. Ed, Wyatt said. Those inquiries you mentioned, the lawyers asking about property lines. Garrity was quiet for a moment. Then he came around his desk and went to his front door, checked the street in both directions, and came back. A man named Tilden came in yesterday afternoon, Garrity said. Said he was conducting a survey on behalf of a private investment concern interested in agricultural properties in the county. Clara felt her stomach drop. What did you tell him? Wyatt asked. I told him public records are public records, and if he wanted to look at them, he could come during business hours like everyone else. Garrity paused. He came back an hour later with a letter from a territorial judge authorizing a formal records review. A territorial judge, Wyatt said. Judge Ambrose Pitts, Garrity said, who I will tell you, I have never known to take an active interest in property records in this county before, who also I will tell you spent 3 weeks in Boston last November, though I suppose that's the kind of coincidence that doesn't mean anything. The silence in the office was very particular. What records did he review? Clara asked. Garrity looked at her with a new kind of attention. The holdings on the North Ridge, he said. 3 parcels. 2 of them federally held. 1 of them in legal dispute since the original owner died without clear succession. What's the dispute? Clara asked. The deceased man's son claims inheritance, Garrity said. The problem is, the son left the territory 15 years ago, and the documentation supporting his claim has some irregularities. What kind of irregularities? Garrity paused. The kind that look very much like the documentation was prepared by someone who knew what the documentation needed to say but didn't have access to the original. Forgeries, Clara said. Garrity didn't confirm it out loud. He didn't have to. If those parcels were cleared for transfer, Wyatt said slowly, with a railroad right-of-way attached, someone would become extremely wealthy, Garrity said. And the families who have ranched this valley for 30 years would find their access to the northern grazing land either restricted or gone entirely. Clara looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at the land records on Garrity's desk. Ed, he said, those copies you made. Safe, Garrity said simply. Good, Wyatt said. Keep them that way. On the ride back from town, Clara sat on the wagon bench next to Wyatt and thought about Richard Vail buying a judge in Boston so that a man named Tilden could walk into a Montana land office with legal authorization and nobody could stop him from looking at exactly what he needed to see. She thought about the forged succession documents. She thought about the North Ridge parcels. She thought about the railroad. And she thought about the fact that Richard had tracked her here, and she understood now with the cold clarity that comes when things you suspected stop being suspicions and become facts that tracking her here might not have been the primary mission at all. She might have been the coincidence, the excuse, the reason that justified the trip that had been planned for an entirely different purpose. "He used me," she said. Wyatt glanced at her. "Not the way you think," she said. "Or not only the way I thought. My leaving gave him a reason to come here, a personal reason. The kind of reason that makes a man's presence in a place seem obvious and private rather than business." She paused. "A man conducting a land acquisition scheme doesn't want people asking why he's here. But a man looking for a woman who ran away from him, that's a story that explains everything and makes everyone sympathetic." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's not just going to come to the ranch." "No," Clara said. "He's going to come to town first. He's going to make friends. He's going to spend money. He's going to tell his story. The worried man, the impulsive woman, the genuine concern. And he's going to make sure that when he does eventually come to the ranch, half the town already thinks he's reasonable, and I'm the problem." "That's how he operates," Wyatt said. "Not a question. Every time," Clara said. "He doesn't fight opposition directly. He removes it before it can form." She stopped. "Wyatt, how many people in this town own land that would be affected by the North Ridge transfer?" Wyatt thought for a moment. 7 or 8 families. The Harmons, the Phelps, Dolores Ashford, a few others. "Do they know what's happening?" "Probably not the details. They need to know," Clara said, "not just because it's right, though it is, but because a man like Richard is much harder to move when there are 8 families asking questions than when there's just one person he's already decided to discredit." Wyatt looked at her with that steady attention. "When did you start thinking like a general?" he said. "I had a good teacher," Clara said. He frowned slightly. "Who?" "Richard," she said. "I watched him for long enough. I know how he builds. That means I know where the weak points are." Something shifted in Wyatt's expression. Something that wasn't quite admiration, but was close to it, and that came with a kind of respect that felt different from being called brave or strong. Because it wasn't about her surviving something, it was about her understanding something. "All right," he said. "Let's go talk to the Harmons." Margaret Harmon was 61 years old, had lived in the valley for 23 years, and had a way of listening that made Clara think of a very still body of water calm on the surface, but with a great deal of movement happening below it that you'd be foolish to underestimate. Her husband Frank had died 4 years ago, and she ran the ranch with her son, a quiet 28-year-old named Davis, who said very little but had his mother's eyes thoughtful and measuring and not easily impressed. Wyatt explained the situation with the North Ridge. He laid it out plainly without embellishment. The way Clara was coming to understand was his only mode, direct, factual, and confident that the facts were enough without drama added to them. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How long have you known about this?" "We found out this morning," Wyatt said. Margaret looked at Clara. "And you're the woman from Boston who knows this man Vale personally?" "I am," Clara said. "You left him." "I did." Margaret studied her for a long moment. Not unkindly. Just with the thoroughness of a woman who had been reading people in a small community for 20 years and knew what genuine fear looked like versus performance. "Good judgment," Margaret said finally. Then she turned back to Wyatt. "What do you need from us?" "Mostly," Wyatt said, "for you to know what's happening, and maybe to not make it easy for whoever Vale sends to gather information about who owns what and where the lines are." Margaret made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That shouldn't be hard. I've never been easy to gather information from." She looked at her son. "Davis, go to the Phelps and the Ashfords. Tell them Wyatt's coming by tonight." Davis nodded and left without a word. Margaret turned back to Clara. "You said he'll come to town first and try to build sympathy," she said. "What's his story going to be?" Clara thought about it. Something sympathetic, but just uncomfortable enough to be credible. A family desperate for their daughter. A man who cared genuinely about a woman who had a difficult time and made an impulsive decision. He'll include something slightly unflattering about himself, some small admission, because that makes everything else sound more honest. Margaret tilted her head. You know him very well. I survived him for long enough, Clara said. That counts, Margaret said. When he comes to town and based on what you're saying, it'll be soon. What do you want this community to do? Clara hadn't expected the question. She had expected to be told what would be done, or to be worked around, or to have her input received politely and then set aside. She had not expected a woman she'd met 20 minutes ago to turn the question fully back to her and wait for an actual answer. She thought carefully. Nothing dramatic, she said. That's what he'd want, something he could point to as unreasonable. Just be the kind of community where people ask questions, where a stranger who arrives with money and a story has to answer some of those questions before the story is accepted. She paused. And if he asks about me, don't lie, but don't offer more than he's asked. Let him work for every piece. Margaret nodded slowly. We can do that, she said. We've been doing that for years with railroad men and government surveyors. We're good at it by now. Clara felt something ease in her chest. Not the full weight, not nearly, but some portion of the loneliness that came with being the only person who understood the danger lifted, because now she wasn't the only person anymore. They spent the rest of that day moving between the Valley families. The Phelps were younger, mid-30s, 2 children still building their operation, and they received the information with the tight-faced seriousness of people who understood exactly how much they had to lose. Dolores Ashford, who had been ranching the valley since before half the current residents arrived, listened to the whole thing with her arms crossed and then said, I'd like to see a Boston merchant try to take my north pasture, in a tone that made it clear she would find the attempt somewhat entertaining. By the time Wyatt and Clara returned to the ranch, the sun had gone low and the day had worn itself out. Clara was tired in a way that felt different from exhaustion. It was the specific tired that came from using her mind hard, from thinking strategically and quickly, and staying 2 steps ahead of a situation rather than 2 steps behind it. She hadn't felt this way in a long time. She had spent the last several months feeling only reactive, responding to threats, running from consequences, surviving moments as they arrived. She had not felt like someone actively shaping the situation since the morning she had walked out of her family's house before sunrise. That morning felt very far away. You did well today, Wyatt said, as they put the horses up for the night. You don't have to say that, Clara said. I know I don't, he said. I said it because it's true. You understand this man in a way I can't, and you used that today. Watching you talk to Margaret Harmon, you weren't afraid. Clara thought about that. I was, she said. I'm afraid most of the time. I've just gotten better at continuing anyway. Wyatt paused in what he was doing and looked at her. That, he said quietly, is the whole thing, isn't it? She didn't ask what he meant. She knew what he meant. 4 days passed. They were not quiet days. There was too much beneath the surface for anything to be truly quiet. But they were days with a shape to them. A routine that Clara was settling into, the way you settle into a landscape, not because it becomes familiar all at once, but because you stop noticing the edges as much. She was learning to ride properly, not the careful, supervised way of their first few sessions, but actually ride Wyatt, putting her on a steady-natured bay mare named Scout, and letting her take the animal through the pasture at speeds that made her chest open up in a way she had not felt in years. The speed and the wind, and the complete requirement of full attention, body and mind, both committed to the same thing at the same time, leaving no room in her head for anything else. She came back from the first real run with her hair half out of its pins and her cheeks flushed, and Wyatt was leaning on the fence rail watching her, and he looked, she couldn't identify it exactly. At first he looked like someone watching something they were relieved to see. Again, she asked. Again, he said. She turned Scout and went again. She found out about Richard's arrival the way most news arrived, in a small valley through someone else. It was Margaret Harmon's boy Davis, who came riding to the ranch on a Thursday morning 7 days after Tilden's visit, with a message that was characteristically brief. He's in town. Checked into Millhaven's boarding house last night. Brought 2 men with him. People are talking. Clara read the note twice. Then she set it on the kitchen table and stood very still for a moment. She had known it was coming. She had prepared for it in every practical way she could think of. She had spoken to the families in the valley and watched Wyatt have a long conversation with Ed Garrity, and understood that the community around her was paying attention in ways that made Richard Vale's usual approach more difficult. None of that stopped the cold from moving through her when she read that he was here. He was in this town. 7 miles away. The same man who had stood in her parents' parlor and told her in the pleasant voice he used for everything that her refusal didn't matter and that she would eventually understand that. Wyatt came in from outside and took one look at her and said, "He's here." "Last night," Clara said. Wyatt sat down at the table. "All right," he said. "What does he do first?" Clara breathed carefully. "He'll spend today and tomorrow being visible, buying things in the general store, talking in the saloon. Not about me yet, that comes after he's established himself as a reasonable man. He'll talk about Boston, about business, about the territory. He'll ask questions that seem like casual interest." "He'll ask about the land," Wyatt said. "Yes, but carefully, wrapped in other things. And then he'll introduce the personal element. The worried family, the impulsive young woman, his own genuine affection. That's how he'll frame it. He'll make sure to be seen as sympathetic before he makes any kind of move." "How long does that take him?" 3-4 days usually," Clara said. "He's patient when the situation requires it." She paused. "He's also very good at reading when patience is costing him something and adjusting. If he senses the community isn't receiving him the way he wants, he might move faster." "Margaret and the others will hold," Wyatt said. "I know they will," Clara said. "But he'll be looking for the weakest point. There's always someone who's more susceptible to money or flattery or a convincing story. He'll find whoever that is and work through them." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you afraid of seeing him?" Clara had been waiting for this question without knowing she was waiting for it. "Yes," she said honestly. "Okay," Wyatt said. "Just that. Not a solution, not reassurance, not a dismissal of the fear. Just an acknowledgement that it was real, and it was understandable, and it didn't change anything they were going to do." "Okay," Clara repeated very quietly to herself. The moment came sooner than she expected. Not Richard himself, not yet, but his shadow, which arrived the next morning in the form of a woman named Pauline Sayers, who ran the dry goods store and was the valley's most reliable transmitter of information in both directions. Pauline arrived at the ranch with the stated purpose of welcoming Clara formally. She was the first person from town who had come specifically to do that, and Clara was genuinely glad to see her. They drank tea and talked about nothing particularly consequential for about 20 minutes, and Clara was almost relaxed when Pauline said very gently, "That gentleman from Boston came into the store yesterday." Clara set down her cup. "He was very pleasant," Pauline said. She said it carefully, not endorsing, just reporting. "He talked for quite a while. He said—" She stopped. "I want you to hear this from me, rather than from someone who might tell it differently." "Tell me," Clara said. Pauline looked at her hands. "He said you'd had a very difficult time before you left Boston. That you'd been through things that affected your judgment. He was very careful about how he said it. Concerned. Like a man who cared about someone and was worried for them." She paused. "He said the marriage arrangement was made to protect you, that it was something your family felt was best for you at a time when you couldn't see clearly for yourself." Clara sat very still. She could feel the architecture of it, the perfect, careful structure of it, the way he had taken every real thing and bent it until it pointed in a different direction. Her genuine difficulty turned into evidence of instability. Her refusal turned into symptom rather than decision. His pursuit turned into concern. "What did you say?" Clara asked. "I said that you seemed clear-eyed enough to me," Pauline said. "And that in my experience, a woman who set a fence post crooked by mistake and then corrected it and set the next 3 perfectly didn't sound like someone whose judgment was impaired." Clara looked up. "I talked to Wyatt last week." Pauline said simply. He told me you'd been helping with the fences. Clara felt something warm move through her chest, not because Pauline had defended her, but because Pauline had defended her with something real. Not sentiment, not loyalty, not discomfort with conflict, with a specific, concrete, observable thing. "Thank you," Clara said. "I also told him," Pauline said, and now her voice had a different quality to it, careful, almost apologetic, that 3 families in the valley had received letters this week from a law firm in Boston offering to purchase their property at a price above what they'd get in any other market. She stopped. "That's not nothing." Clara breathed in slowly. "No, it's not nothing." "Is it connected?" Pauline asked. "Yes," Clara said. "But I can't prove it yet." Pauline nodded once. "Then I'd suggest moving quickly," she said. "Because men like that one, men who are good at seeming reasonable, they do a lot of damage in the time it takes to prove something." That evening, Clara sat with Wyatt on the porch and told him about the letters. He already knew about 2 of them Davis Harmon had ridden by while Clara was meeting with Pauline. The Phelps and one of the smaller operations in the south end of the valley had each received an offer from a Boston firm called Meridian Land Associates. "That's his company," Clara said. "Or one of them. He uses different names for different operations. Meridian is one I heard my father mention." "So he's already moving on the properties," Wyatt said. "He didn't wait." "He never waits when he thinks he has leverage," Clara said. "Sending letters means he believes he already controls enough of the situation. The sympathy campaign in town is cover the real work is already happening." She looked at Wyatt. "He's going to come here soon, not in a few days, probably tomorrow." Wyatt didn't argue with the assessment. He'd learned in 10 days of living alongside her that when Clara read a situation, she read it correctly. "Ed Garrity needs to know tonight," he said. "Tonight," Clara agreed. "And the letters need to be documented," he said. "Every family that received one needs to put it in writing when it arrived, what it said, who sent it. If the forged land documents are the foundation of what he's building, the offer letters are the next level up. Together, they tell a story." Clara looked at him. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "All day," he said simply. She almost said something. She stopped herself because what she almost said was something about how different it felt to be inside a problem with someone rather than alone with it. And she didn't know yet if she had the right to say that, or whether saying it would mean something she wasn't ready for it to mean. Instead, she said, "I'll get my coat." And Wyatt said, "I'll get the horses." And that was enough. They rode to Garrity's house after dark and found him already awake, which was either coincidence or the sign of a man who had been expecting visitors. He received the information about Meridian Land Associates with a careful stillness, made notes in the small, precise handwriting of a man who had spent 30 years keeping records, and said he would ride to the county seat first thing in the morning to file a formal notice of inquiry with the Territorial Land Commission. "That won't stop them," Clara said. "No," Garrity said. "But it starts a record. A man like Vale can maneuver around a great many things. The one thing he cannot maneuver around is a clear documented record that existed before he made his move." On the ride back, Clara thought about records. She thought about what she knew. Not what she suspected, but what she actually knew from direct experience about Richard Vale and the way he operated. She thought about conversations she'd overheard between her father and Richard's attorney. She thought about a particular evening in Boston 8 months ago, when she'd been sitting in the library with the door almost closed, and she'd heard her father say, "But the succession document, are you certain it's clean?" And she'd heard Richard's attorney say, "Clean enough. The original owner's been dead 4 years, and the son's been in California. By the time anyone looks closely, the transfer will be complete." She had not understood what that meant at the time. She understood it now, and she understood something else she was a witness. She hadn't thought of herself that way. She'd thought of herself as the woman who ran. The woman who knew Richard's face and character and methods. She hadn't thought about the specific things she had heard, the actual words, as something that had legal weight. But they did. "Wyatt," she said. He turned to look at her in the darkness. "I'm a witness," she said. "I heard things in Boston, specific things, about the succession document." Wyatt went very still. "Tell me," he said. She told him. When she finished, the only sound was the horse's hooves on the road and the wind in the grass. Then Wyatt said quietly, "Ed needs to hear this. Tonight." They turned the horses around, and as they rode back toward Garrity's house in the dark, Clara Whitmore understood that the woman who had arrived in Willow Creek carrying only a suitcase and a fear so large it had swallowed everything else was gone. Something else had taken her place, not fearless because the fear was still there, still real, still present, but purposeful. A woman who was not only running from something anymore, but moving toward something. And the something she was moving toward was the truth, which it turned out was heavier than a suitcase and more powerful than anything Richard Vale had ever tried to hold over her. She rode faster. And in the window of Ed Garrity's house, a light was still burning. Ed Garrity listened to Clara's account without interrupting, which was the mark of a man who understood that interrupting a witness while they were remembering something specific was the fastest way to lose the detail that mattered most. He sat behind his desk with a pen in his hand and did not write anything down until she finished, and then he wrote quickly, capturing everything she'd said in that precise, unhurried script of his before the exact words had a chance to soften into paraphrase. When he set down the pen, he looked at her over the desk. "You heard the attorney say the words, 'succession document,'" he said. "You heard him say the original owner had been dead 4 years. You heard him say the transfer would be complete before anyone looked closely." "Yes," Clara said. "And the attorney's name, Harlan Moss," Clara said. "He has an office on Tremont Street in Boston. He's been Richard's legal representative for at least 4 years. My father's firm worked with him before the business troubles." Garrity wrote that down too. "Miss Whitmore," he said, setting down the pen carefully. "What you've just given me is not nothing. What you've described is direct evidence of foreknowledge of a fraudulent document. That doesn't mean it's easy to act on a witness account from a woman who left Boston under unusual circumstances against a wealthy man with a territorial judge in his pocket is not an uncomplicated thing." He paused. "But it is real, and real things can be built on." "How quickly can you contact the Territorial Land Commission?" Wyatt asked. "I'll ride at first light," Garrity said. "I have a contact there, a man named Aldrich, who I've known for 20 years, and who is not susceptible to money in the way that Judge Pitts apparently is." He looked between them. "Go home, get some sleep. Whatever Vale is planning, he won't move tonight, and you'll need to be clear-headed when he does." It was practical advice. Clara slept 3 hours. The morning came in gray and cold, the kind of morning that felt like the sky was making up its mind, and Clara was at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee when she heard a horse on the road that didn't pass. She heard it slow. She heard it stop. Her cup was on the table before she'd consciously decided to set it down. Wyatt came through from the back of the house, moving quickly, not running, but with that decisive speed of his that meant he'd heard it too and had already assessed it. "2 horses," he said quietly. "Maybe 3. Clara crossed to the window. 3 horses. 3 men. The one in the middle was wearing a gray coat and a city hat, and even from this distance, even after months of putting geography between herself and that particular silhouette, Clara's body recognized him before her mind finished the thought. Richard Vale. He sat his horse the way he did everything, with the easy, unself-conscious confidence of a man who had never spent significant time wondering whether he belonged somewhere. He looked at the ranch house, and the fence, and the barn, with the measuring gaze of a man calculating what something was worth, which was how he looked at everything, including people. Including her. Clara's hands were steady. She noticed that. Made herself notice it deliberately, because the fear was there, absolutely present, moving through her chest the way cold water moves through a system, finding every space. But her hands were steady, and that was something. "He brought 2 men," she said. "I see them," Wyatt said. "The one on the left is Tilden," she said. I don't know the other one. Doesn't matter who he is, Wyatt said. He looked at Clara, not at the men outside, at Clara. How do you want to do this? She took a breath. Together, she said. I'm not staying in the house. Something moved across his face approval, maybe though quieter than that word usually implied. He nodded once and opened the front door. Richard Vale's expression when Clara appeared on the porch beside Wyatt was a masterpiece of controlled reaction. The surprise was there genuine, she thought, because he had not expected her to walk out the front door herself, but it was contained within 2 seconds, replaced smoothly by the expression he had clearly rehearsed on the ride out from town. The concerned man, the reasonable man, the man who had traveled a long way because he cared. Clara, he said, and his voice carried exactly the right amount of warmth and relief. Thank God. I've been worried sick about you. Clara said nothing. She stood on the porch with her hands at her sides and looked at him. The silence lasted just long enough to disrupt the script he'd prepared. Richard dismounted anyway, handing his reins to Tilden with the ease of a man accustomed to other people managing his horse. He walked toward the porch, with his hands loose at his sides, deliberate she knew, because loose hands looked unthreatening, and stopped at the foot of the steps. You must be Callahan, he said to Wyatt. He said it pleasantly. Not aggressive, not dismissive, just the acknowledgement of a confident man who had no reason to feel threatened by another man in a situation he believed he controlled. I appreciate you looking after her. The family has been through a great deal. Mr. Vale, Wyatt said. His voice was the same as always, steady, unhurried, giving nothing away. I'd like a few minutes with Clara, Richard said. Still to Wyatt, as though Clara's presence in the conversation required mediation. Privately, if that's possible. There are some things I need to say to her, and I think she deserves to hear them without... Whatever you have to say to me, Clara said, you can say it here. Richard turned to look at her. This was the moment she had rehearsed in her head 100 times, the moment of first direct contact when his eyes landed on her and the full weight of what he represented came down. She had wondered in the nights she couldn't sleep whether she would flinch, whether the old reflexive smallness would come back, the trained instinct to make herself less so as to give less target. She did not flinch. She looked at him, and she saw something she had never seen in Richard Vale's face before, because she had never been in a position to see it. A very small, very brief moment of recalibration where he recognized that the person standing on this porch was not the same person who had walked out the back door of her family's house before sunrise. He recovered quickly. Of course, he said, smooth, accommodating. Clara, I want to start by apologizing. She had not expected that, which was precisely why he said it. I handled things badly in Boston, he said. The arrangement with your father was made in what I believed were your best interests, but I understand now that you felt pressured. I should have spoken with you first, directly. I should have asked what you wanted. He paused, perfectly calibrated. I made assumptions, and I was wrong. Clara studied him. She let the silence breathe for a long moment. Then she said, Which assumptions specifically? Richard blinked. I'm sorry. You said you made assumptions, Clara said. I'd like to know which ones you mean. That I would eventually agree. That my refusal was negotiable. That my father's word was sufficient to finalize an arrangement that concerned my life. She kept her voice level. Which assumption are you apologizing for, Richard? Because the list is long, and I want to be certain we're talking about the same thing. The pleasant expression on Richard's face didn't disappear, but it tightened, just around the eyes. I can see you're still angry, he said. I'm clear, Clara said. That's not the same thing. It lasted another 20 minutes. Richard was good. She had never denied that he was good. He moved through the conversation with the practiced flexibility of a man who had been outmaneuvering opposition for decades, adjusting his approach each time one angle didn't produce the result he wanted, finding new framings, new sympathies, new appeals. He appealed to her family, to her mother's distress. He appealed to practicality. The difficulty of a woman's life on the frontier. The uncertainty of an arrangement built on letters rather than established connection. He appealed finally and most carefully to her intelligence, suggesting that a woman of her capability deserved better than what she had currently, as though capability and choice were separable things that he could hold at different heights and make her reach for the wrong one. Wyatt did not speak during any of this. Clara had not asked him to be quiet, and she did not think he was being quiet because he lacked things to say. She thought he was quiet because he understood better maybe than she'd realized that this was her fight to lead, and that the most important thing he could do right now was stand beside her without making it smaller by taking it over. That understanding, that specific deliberate restraint, made her chest ache in a way she didn't have language for yet. She handled Richard herself. She answered every appeal directly without anger, without the trembling that used to come when she had to hold position against him. When he appealed to her family, she told him her concern for her family was separate from her willingness to sacrifice her life for their convenience. When he appealed to practicality, she told him she'd been practically managing a working ranch for 2 weeks and found it considerably more practical than her life in Boston had been. When he appealed to her intelligence, she looked at him for a long moment and said, "Using my intelligence to evaluate the situation is exactly what I've done, Richard. You don't like the conclusion it reached." Bumpkin dimkin made to mumtiriye. His jaw tightened. Clara. The warmth finally had something underneath it. Not quite anger, he was too controlled for anger this early, but pressure. The real thing showing through the presentation. "I'm going to be direct with you." "Please," she said. "That would be a change." "This situation cannot continue," he said. "You are not legally free of your family's obligations. Your father's debts include instruments that name you as a secondary guarantor, documents you signed when you were 19 without fully understanding their implications. Those instruments give me legal standing to—" "No," Clara said. Richard stopped. "Those documents were signed under my father's name," Clara said. "I was 19, and I signed where I was told to sign on papers I was told were household accounts. If those documents name me as a guarantor for a debt I had no knowledge of, that signature is not legally binding, and any lawyer worth his fee will tell you exactly that." She met his eyes. "You know that. You knew it before you said it. That was a test to see whether I knew it." The silence was different from all the other silences. Wyatt, she felt rather than saw, had become even more still. Richard looked at her. For the first time, he looked at her the way you look at something that has genuinely surprised you. "You've been doing your homework," he said. "I've had good help," Clara said. Richard's gaze moved to Wyatt, and this time it was not the assessment of a confident man who had no reason to feel threatened. It was something else. A measurement, a recalibration. "Callahan," he said. "You're a rancher, a small operation. I've been in your county for 2 days, and I understand what's at stake for men like you in this valley." He said it conversationally, like he was commenting on the weather. "There are opportunities here. Men who are willing to work with the development of this territory rather than against it find that their circumstances can improve considerably." "Get off my property," Wyatt said. "No preamble, no warmth, no anger. Just get off my property. The way you say it when it's the only thing left to say." Richard looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "This isn't over." And it was the first honest thing he had said since he rode in. He turned, walked back to his horse, and mounted with the easy precision of a man who intended everyone watching to understand that he was leaving by choice. Tilden and the third man followed without a word. Clara watched them ride back toward the main road. She stood on the porch until the sound of hooves was completely gone. Then she sat down on the porch steps because her legs had decided they were finished standing. Wyatt sat down beside her. Not close enough to crowd, just close enough to be present. Neither of them said anything for a while. "The dead instruments," Wyatt said finally. "Did you actually know they weren't binding?" "I knew enough to guess," Clara said. "Ed Garrity helped me think through the legal framework 2 nights ago when we were there. He said coerced signatures on undisclosed documents were a weak foundation, and that any competent court would look hard at the circumstances. She paused. I wasn't certain, but I was certain enough. That's usually how it works, Wyatt said. Clara exhaled. He's not going to leave, she said. No. That line about the territory about men who work with development rather than against it. That was a threat directed at you. I heard it, Wyatt said. He'll go after the land now. He was probably already moving on it before he came here, but now he'll accelerate. Coming here and not getting what he wanted, he doesn't absorb that quietly. He responds by removing the thing that made it difficult. Meaning us, Wyatt said. Meaning the community that's standing together, Clara said. He'll try to find a crack. One family that takes the money. One person who can be convinced or pressured or given enough reason to stop being a problem. She looked at Wyatt. Who's the most vulnerable, not morally, financially? Who in the valley is in a position where an above-market offer might be too difficult to turn down? Wyatt was quiet for a moment. The Phelps, he said reluctantly. They had a bad winter last year. Lost 2 horses and a significant portion of their cattle in a freeze. They've been rebuilding, but they're thin. Richard will find that out, Clara said, if he hasn't already. We need to talk to them today. Yes, Clara said. She stood up. The legs had decided to cooperate again. Now. Good. Nora Phelps was 34 and looked 5 years older the way ranch women sometimes did when several hard years had landed consecutively, not diminished by it, but marked by it carrying it in the set of her jaw and the efficiency of her movements, the way she'd learned to do everything quickly because slowness was a luxury she couldn't afford. She met them at the door before they knocked, which meant she'd seen them coming and had been waiting. I know why you're here, she said. The offer letter, Clara said. Nora stepped back to let them in. Her husband Tom was at the table, young, broad-shouldered, with the careful eyes of a man working very hard not to show how worried he was. The letter was already on the table. Wyatt picked it up and read it. Clara read it over his shoulder. The amount was specific and generous and real, nearly double what the property would fetch in the current market, which meant Meridian Land Associates had done their homework on what a struggling operation could not easily refuse. When did it come? Wyatt asked. 3 days ago, Tom said. We didn't say anything because... He stopped. Because you weren't sure yet, Clara said gently. He looked at her. We have 2 children, Nora said. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of the specific weight she carried every day, and she said it with the dignity of a woman who was not going to be made to feel ashamed of that weight. I know, Clara said. That amount of money, Tom started, would solve your immediate problems and create larger ones, Clara said. Not because you'd have done anything wrong, but because the man behind this offer is not buying your land for its agricultural value. He's buying access to the North Ridge parcels for a railroad right-of-way, and once that deal is complete, the valley changes. Properties that don't sell will be surrounded by rail infrastructure and the access disputes that come with it. The families that stayed will spend years in legal battles with a corporation that has more lawyers than this entire territory has judges. Tom and Nora looked at each other. The look of 2 people who had been having the same conversation in private and hadn't found their way to the end of it yet. Is there another way? Nora asked. Not to Wyatt, to Clara. Clara thought about it honestly. This was not a moment for false reassurance, because false reassurance was the luxury of people who weren't the ones carrying the actual risk. There might be, she said. Ed Garrity is in contact with the Territorial Land Commission, the forged succession documents that form the foundation of Vale's claim on the North Ridge parcels. If those can be formally challenged and discredited before the transfer is complete, his entire scheme falls apart. Without the North Ridge, the right-of-way doesn't work. Without the right-of-way, your land is worth exactly what it was worth before, which is something not nothing. How long does that take? Tom asked. I don't know exactly, Clara said. Days maybe. Maybe longer. I won't tell you it's certain because it isn't. She looked at him. But I can tell you that the man who sent that letter broke the law to get this far. Men who break laws leave evidence, and the evidence is being collected. Nora looked at the letter on the table. Then she picked it up. She folded it once deliberately and handed it to Clara. "In case it's useful," she said. Clara took it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Nora said. "Win first." They were halfway back to the ranch when Wyatt said, "He moved faster than you expected." "Yes," Clara said. Which means something changed his timeline," she said. She had been thinking about it since they left the Phelps ranch. The fact that Richard, who was patient when patience served him, had come to the ranch personally the morning after arriving in town, rather than spending the customary days building goodwill. He knew we'd been to Garrity, or he suspected it. "Tilden," Wyatt said. "Tilden was watching Garrity's office," Clara said. "Or watching the road. Either way, he saw us. He reported back, and Richard decided that his usual timeline was a liability." She looked at Wyatt. "He knows we're building something against him. He came to the ranch to see what he was dealing with before he decided how to accelerate. And now he knows." "And now he knows," Clara said. "Which means we have less time than we thought." The horses covered the road in silence for a moment. Then Wyatt said, "There's someone else we should talk to." "Who?" "Sheriff Braddock." Clara considered that. She had thought about the sheriff every time she mapped the situation. She came back to the question of law enforcement and what it could or couldn't do. "Will he help?" "He's an honest man," Wyatt said, which is both his strongest quality and his primary limitation. Honest men work inside the law, and right now the law in this territory has been partially purchased by the man we're working against. He paused. "But Braddock keeps his own records, and if we can get him looking at the formal complaint before Vale gets to him." "We need to get there first," Clara said immediately. "That's what I was going to say." She looked at him. "You were going to get there eventually." "I was going to work up to it tactfully," he said. She almost smiled. "We don't have time for tact." "We really don't," he agreed and turned his horse toward town. Sheriff Braddock was a weathered man of 53 who had the particular physicality of someone who had spent decades being the person other people called when things went wrong. Solid, deliberate, with a face that had witnessed enough human difficulty to have achieved a kind of permanent equilibrium, neither surprised nor unsurprised by anything. He listened to the whole account. He did not write anything down while they talked, which initially worried Clara. She had come to associate note-taking with the specific seriousness of people who intended to do something with what they were hearing. But when they finished, he opened his desk drawer and produced a file folder that was already thick with paper. "Tilden came in yesterday morning," Braddock said, "with a letter from Judge Pitts authorizing a formal welfare inquiry into your whereabouts." He looked at Clara. "I told him that as far as I could determine, you were present in this county by choice, and had not at any point requested assistance, and therefore there was no welfare inquiry to conduct." He paused. "Tilden told me I was obstructing a judicial order. I told him that a judicial order from a Boston shipping merchant wearing a judge's signature was something I'd be happy to forward to the territorial governor for clarification." Clara stared at him. "He didn't like that," Braddock said. "I imagine not," Wyatt said. "I've been watching this operation for 6 weeks," Braddock said, "since the first inquiry letters arrived at Garrity's office. I didn't know the name behind it until 2 days ago." He looked at the folder. "Richard Vale has done this before. Not in Montana, in Wyoming 4 years ago. A land consolidation scheme near Laramie. It worked there because the local law enforcement was bought before anyone understood what was happening." He closed the folder. "It is not going to work here." Clara felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was still clenched. "What do you need from us?" Wyatt asked. "The witness account," Braddock said, looking at Clara. "Written, signed, dated today." He slid paper across the desk. "Everything you heard in Boston, every name, every date you can remember, every specific phrase. The more specific, the more useful." Clara pulled the paper toward her and picked up the pen. She wrote for 20 minutes without stopping. When she finished the account, covered both sides of 3 sheets, and her hand was slightly cramped, and she felt lighter in a way that had nothing to do with the physical weight of the pages. She had been carrying those words for 8 months. They were someone else's problem now. Braddock read through it carefully, making small marks in the margins. "This is good," he said, and he said it the way Garrity said things, like a statement of assessment rather than a compliment. The attorney's name especially. Harlan Moss has a file in the territorial records from a previous transaction that raised questions. This connects them. "What happens next?" Clara asked. "I send a wire to the territorial governor's office tonight," Braddock said. "I contact the Land Commission. Garrity's already in motion on that end, which helps. And I pay a visit to Mr. Vale at Millhaven's boarding house tomorrow morning to explain clearly and specifically that his operations in this county are under formal review and that any further contact with local landowners regarding property transactions is to cease immediately pending that review." "He'll get around it," Clara said. "Probably," Braddock said. "Men with money usually find a way around the first obstacle. That's what the second obstacle is for." He looked at her directly. "You held your ground this morning." She looked up. "You heard." Millhaven's wife was at Pauline Sayer's store when Tilden came back and reported to her husband, Braddock said. "In a town this size, everything travels. What traveled was that you stood on that porch and didn't move, and that you knew exactly what the debt instrument said, and that you handled yourself." He paused. "That matters. People saw it. People will remember it when Vale tries to reframe you as someone unreliable." Clara absorbed that. She hadn't thought about being seen. She had been too focused on the conversation itself to think about it as a performance in the community theater of a small town's judgment. "Is that going to be enough?" she asked. "Combined with everything else?" Braddock considered it. "It's enough to start. Vale's still dangerous. He has money and connections, and he knows how to use both. But he's operating on ground that isn't as soft as he expected, and he knows that now." The sheriff stood, indicating the meeting was finished. "Miss Whitmore, I want you to understand something. You came here and told the truth. You kept telling it even when it was complicated, and even when you had reason to believe it might not be believed. That is not a small thing." Clara stood. She said, "Someone once told me that courage is usually just terror that decided to move anyway." Braddock looked at her with something in his face that was close to a smile. "Whoever told you that," he said, "was right." The evening came in quietly, and the ranch was peaceful in the specific way that things are peaceful when the worst of the day is over and the next difficulty hasn't started yet. Clara and Wyatt ate supper without discussing Richard Vale or the Land Commission or the succession documents or anything else that had occupied the entire day. They talked about the north fence that still needed a section repaired, about Scout the Mayor's tendency to test the gate latch, about whether the garden beside the house would be better with more shade. It was the most ordinary conversation Clara had participated in for longer than she could remember. She was in the middle of a sentence about the garden when she realized her hands were completely still. No tension, no monitoring, no waiting for the thing that was coming. She stopped talking. Wyatt looked at her. "You just noticed something," he said. "My hands," she said. She looked at them on the table. "They're still." He looked at them too. "Is that new?" he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded once and turned back to his supper and did not make anything more of it, because the right response to a person noticing that they have become less afraid than they were was not ceremony. It was just the quiet acknowledgement that it was true, and then letting it be true. Clara picked up her fork. She thought about Richard Vale in his room at Millhaven's boarding house, recalculating, redrawing his approach, preparing his next move. She thought about the 3 pages in Braddock's file. She thought about Nora Phelps handing her the letter. She thought about Margaret Harmon saying "win" first. And she thought about Wyatt Callahan, who had sat beside her on that porch after Richard rode away and asked her only one question. How do you want to handle this? Not whether she could handle it. not whether she needed him to handle it instead. Just how do you want to? Outside, the wind was moving through the grass, with the sound of something large and continuous that had been happening long before any of this, and would continue long after. Clara finished her supper. The hands stayed still, but the night was not finished yet. Because at 7:30, when the dishes were clean and the kitchen was quiet, they heard a horse on the road again. Fast this time. The urgent kind of fast that meant something had happened. Wyatt was at the door before Clara had fully pushed back her chair. She was behind him in 3 steps. Davis Harmon pulled up to the gate, breathing hard, his horse dark with sweat. "Garrity," he said. "Someone broke into the land office tonight." The stillness in Clara's hands vanished. "The copies," she said. "The documents he made." "The office copies are gone," Davis said. "Everything from the drawer." He looked between them. "But Mr. Garrity says the duplicates he kept at home are safe. He wants you to know that." He caught his breath. "He also wants you to know that whoever broke in wasn't careful. They left the door forced. It's not subtle." "Vale wanted it found," Wyatt said. "Why?" Davis asked. Clara understood it before Wyatt answered. "Because a break-in is intimidation," she said. "He's not only after the documents, he's telling us that he can reach anywhere he wants, that no record is safe, that the ground we think we're standing on can disappear." She looked at Wyatt. "He's trying to scare people off." "Is it working?" Davis asked. Clara looked at him. "No," she said. But her hands were not still anymore, and somewhere in Willow Creek, in a boarding house room, Richard Vale was making a list of the things he was willing to do to win this, and that list was longer than it had been that morning. She could feel it. The next move was coming, and this time it was going to be aimed directly at the thing she had only recently found, the one thing that if Richard destroyed it, would take everything else with it. Not her safety, not the ranch, not the legal case, the trust she had finally carefully, impossibly learned to let herself feel. Wyatt sent Davis Harmon home with a message for his mother. Stay inside tonight, lock the doors, and tell the Phelps the same, and then he and Clara rode to Ed Garrity's house in the dark without discussing whether they should. Garrity answered the door before they knocked, which meant he'd been listening for horses. He looked tired in a way that went past the hour. Not the tiredness of a man who needed sleep, but the specific tiredness of someone who had spent the last 2 hours understanding that the situation had become more dangerous than he'd calculated, and was in the process of adjusting to that understanding. "They took the file cabinet copies," he said, moving back to let them in. "Everything in the second drawer. The deed inquiry logs, the correspondence from the Boston lawyers, the notation records from Tilden's visit." He paused. They were specific. They knew exactly which drawer. They didn't disturb anything else. "Which means someone told them," Wyatt said. Garrity looked at him. "Yes." The word landed in the room with weight. Clara said, "Who has access to your office?" "Officially myself and my assistant, a young man named Peter Croft, who's worked with me for 2 years. Garrity's voice was careful, not accusatory, just precise. "Peter also has a brother-in-law who arrived in Willow Creek 4 days ago looking for work." Silence. "Does the brother-in-law have a name?" Wyatt asked. "Frank Sully," Garrity said. "He's staying at Millhaven's. Same boarding house as Richard Vale." Clara felt the pieces locked together with the particular cold satisfaction of a pattern completing itself. "Peter didn't do it deliberately," she said. "Or maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but it doesn't matter yet. What matters is the information moved from your office to Millhaven's boarding house, and now the documents are gone." She looked at Garrity. "The copies you kept at home." Garrity crossed to the desk in the corner of his sitting room and opened the bottom drawer. He removed a cloth-wrapped package and set it on the desk. "Everything significant," he said. "The deed transfer records, the irregularity notations, the original inquiry log." He unwrapped the cloth to show them. "I made these copies 3 weeks ago when the situation started feeling wrong. I kept them here because I've been doing this long enough to know that the official location is always the first place someone looks. Clara looked at the documents. "These need to be somewhere else tonight," she said. "Somewhere Vale's people can't find even if they look." "I was thinking the same thing," Garrity said. He looked at Wyatt. "Your ranch." Wyatt nodded without hesitation. "Give them to me." "There's something else," Garrity said. He reached back into the drawer and produced a single folded sheet. "A wire came this afternoon from the Land Commission. My contact Aldrich." He handed it to Wyatt. Wyatt read it. Clara read over his shoulder. The wire was brief. Inquiry received. Succession claim on Northridge parcels flagged for review. Formal hold on transfer pending investigation. Earliest hearing date 7 days. Aldrich, 7 days. "That's the good news," Garrity said. "What's the bad news?" Clara asked. "A transfer hold only means the transfer can't complete through official channels. A man with enough money and a friendly judge can still file emergency motions that complicate things." He paused. "And Vale has already demonstrated he has a friendly judge." "Judge Pitts," Wyatt said. "I spoke with Braddock tonight before you arrived," Garrity said. "He's filed a formal complaint about Pitts's authorization letter with the Territorial Governor's Office. But that process takes time, and time is what Vale is trying to buy," Clara finished. Garrity looked at her. Exactly. She thought about the break-in. The deliberate visibility of it, the forced door, the specific targeting of the right drawer. Richard didn't need to be subtle anymore. He'd passed the stage of building goodwill and moved into the stage of demonstrating capacity. The message wasn't just to Garrity. It was to everyone in the valley who was paying attention. "I can reach anywhere. Nothing you build is safe from me. He's going to come back to the ranch tomorrow," Clara said. She said it with certainty, not speculation. Wyatt looked at her. "Not to talk," she said. "The talking is finished. He came yesterday to assess what he was dealing with, and now he knows about Garrity, he knows about Braddock, he knows we've been building. He won't come to persuade anymore." She paused. "He'll come with paper. Something legal, or something that looks legal. Something that puts Wyatt on the defensive legally and makes the ranch itself a disputed asset." The room was very quiet. "Can he do that?" Wyatt asked. Clara thought carefully. "The debt instruments he mentioned, the ones my father signed. There may be a way to construct an argument that the cost of my passage here, the arrangement itself, constitutes a financial obligation that creates a claim. It's a stretch. Any honest court would reject it. But an emergency injunction from a judge who's already been paid doesn't need to be legally solid. It just needs to exist long enough to create chaos." Garrity sat down slowly. "He'd be using the marriage arrangement against you." "Against both of us," Clara said. "That's the point. If he can put Wyatt in a position of legal liability, even temporarily, even with paperwork that won't survive scrutiny, it creates leverage. Wyatt either agrees to some version of Richard's terms, or he spends months fighting a legal action that costs money he may not have while the ranch suffers." She looked at Wyatt. "I'm sorry, I brought this here." "Stop," Wyatt said. She looked at him. "Don't apologize for him," Wyatt said quietly. "None of what he's doing is yours." She wanted to argue with that. She knew with the specific self-knowledge of a person who had spent months cataloging their own decisions that she was the vector through which this had arrived. Not the cause, she was very clear about the cause, but the path. But Wyatt's voice, when he said it, was not reassuring her. He was telling her something true, and she was learning slowly, imperfectly, to let true things be true when someone said them. "All right," she said. "Then what do we do about tomorrow?" They stayed at Garrity's for another hour, working through it systematically, the way Clara had learned to work through things when the fear was present, but she refused to let it drive, naming each piece, assessing each risk, identifying each place where Richard's approach had a weakness. The weakness in the legal paper strategy was time. Emergency injunctions required filing, processing, judicial signature. Even with a purchased judge, that took hours, likely a full-day minimum. If Richard was planning to arrive at the ranch with paper, he needed to have filed that morning or the night before. Braddock can check the court filings first thing tomorrow, Wyatt said. We need someone at the courthouse before it opens, Clara said. Someone watching for a filing under Vale's name or Meridian Land Associates or any Boston firm. I'll go tonight, Garrity said. The clerk owes me a professional favor, and I know where he lives. Tell him to watch for anything involving the ranch property or my name, Wyatt said. And mine, Clara said. Garrity nodded and reached for his coat. They took the document package and rode back to the ranch through darkness that had gotten deeper and colder, and Clara held the cloth-wrapped package against her chest and thought about how strange it was that the most important thing in the county right now was a collection of paper records about land lines and deed transfers, ink marks on pressed cotton that represented years of families' lives and futures, reduced to something a person could carry under one arm through a cold Montana night. At the ranch, Wyatt took the package to a place he didn't describe to her in detail, somewhere in the barn, she thought, based on the direction he went, and came back without it. Somewhere he won't find it even if he comes in with a warrant, he said. Good, she said. They stood in the kitchen in the specific quiet of two people who had used up all the practical conversation and were left with the thing underneath it. You should sleep, Wyatt said. You should too, Clara said. I will. Neither of them moved. I keep thinking about what he said to you, Clara said. The offer. Men who work with development rather than against it. I know what he meant, Wyatt said. But you didn't consider it, not even for a second. Wyatt looked at her steadily. No. Why not? She asked, and she meant it as a genuine question, not a challenge, not an accusation. She had spent enough time with Richard Vale to know that his offers were usually calibrated precisely to what a person needed, which meant he had looked at Wyatt Callahan and made a calculation about what Wyatt's price was. And Wyatt had heard the offer and turned it down without a visible moment of consideration. Clara wanted to understand why, because understanding it felt important in a way she couldn't fully articulate yet. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Because what he's offering would require being a different kind of man than I am, he said finally. And I'm not interested in that. Clara looked at him. Even if it were easier, she said. Even if the cost of not taking it. Clara, he said. Just her name. The way he said it stopped the sentence. I know what the cost might be. I've ranched this land for 11 years. I know exactly what it's worth to me. He paused. I also know it's not the most important thing I'm trying to hold on to right now. The kitchen was very still. What is? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment, and the answer was in his face before he said it, and she knew it was in her face too. The thing she had been carefully not examining for 2 weeks, because examining it felt like standing too close to the edge of something high. Get some sleep, he said quietly. We have a long day tomorrow. It wasn't an avoidance. It was a kindness, the specific kindness of a man who understood that some things should not be said for the first time in the middle of a crisis, because they deserved better than that. Clara went upstairs. She lay in the dark with the key to her door in her hand. Not because she needed the lock, but because she had developed a habit of holding it when she needed to remember where she was, and she thought about what Wyatt had said, and what he hadn't said, and the particular courage required to not say something at exactly the right moment. She slept 4 hours. It was the most she'd slept in a week. Morning came, and the day began moving fast. Wyatt had coffee made and his hat on before Clara was fully downstairs, which meant he'd been up for a while and thinking. Garrity sent word at first light, he said, setting a cup in front of her. 2 filings at the courthouse last night. 1 under Meridian Land Associates contesting the transfer hold. 1 under a name. He looked at a piece of paper on the table. Whitmore Family Trust filing a welfare petition with the territorial court. Clara set down her cup. Welfare petition, she said flatly. Requesting the court designate a guardian for a named individual described as. Wyatt read from the paper. A young woman of compromised judgment, currently residing in circumstances unsuitable to her welfare. The cold that moved through Clara was different from the fear cold she was used to. This was anger cold. The precise, focused, clarifying cold of a person who has been patient for a very long time and has reached the end of patience. "He's using my family's name," she said. "My father signed that." "That's what it says." "My father signed that," she repeated. And the second time she said it wasn't disbelief, it was something more complicated. Her father, who had been frightened and desperate, and not a strong man. Her father, who she had stopped expecting to protect her long before she left Boston. She had not stopped hoping entirely, even after everything. Hope and expectation were different things, and she had kept the hope separate, even when she'd let go of the expectation. She let go of the hope now. It took about 3 seconds. She picked up her coffee. "What does the welfare petition allow him to do?" she asked. Her voice was entirely level. "It's not an action by itself," Wyatt said. "It's a filing that creates a hearing. The hearing could theoretically result in a court order requiring you to appear before a territorial judge to demonstrate competency and freedom of choice." "A hearing in front of Judge Pitts," Clara said. "That would be the preferred outcome for Vale," Wyatt said. "And if I appear in front of Pitts..." "Anything could happen in a compromised courtroom," Wyatt said. Clara thought carefully through the structure of it. The welfare petition was elegant in its cruelty. It required her to either appear before a judge Vale controlled, or refuse, and have her refusal used as evidence of the very incompetency the petition alleged. It was a trap with 2 exits, both of which led somewhere Richard wanted her to go. "There's a third option," she said. Wyatt looked at her. "Challenge the jurisdiction," she said. "The welfare petition names me as a resident of Boston. I am not a resident of Boston. I am a resident of this county in Montana Territory. A Boston filing and a territorial judge has no jurisdiction over a Montana resident on Montana soil. Braddock can make that argument. Garrity can document the residency." She stopped. "How quickly can we get a letter in front of the territorial governor?" "Braddock filed last night with the governor's office about Pitts," Wyatt said. "He's already in the correspondence." "Then we add this to it," Clara said. "Today, this morning. We add the welfare petition and the jurisdictional argument, and we make sure that the governor's office understands that a compromised judge is being used to circumvent territorial law." Wyatt was already reaching for his hat. "Braddock first," he said. "Braddock first," she agreed. Braddock read the filing, set them on his desk, and looked at Clara with an expression that had moved past equilibrium into something that, in another man, might have been called anger. "He filed the welfare petition at 9:30 last night," Braddock said, "which means he had it drafted before he came to your ranch yesterday morning." Clara absorbed that. "He wrote the petition before he came to talk to me." "He wrote it before he came to talk to you," Braddock confirmed. "The conversation on your porch wasn't a last attempt. It was theater. He was already past persuasion." The room adjusted itself around that fact. "He wanted to see what he was up against," Clara said. "Not because it would change whether he filed, but because it would change how he used the filing. If I'd been frightened or compliant, the petition would be positioned one way. Since I wasn't, he'll use it as evidence of the problem he's describing," Braddock said. "A woman too influenced by her current situation to see her own interests clearly." "Can he make that work?" Wyatt asked. "In front of Pitts, maybe." Braddock leaned back. "Not in front of anyone else." He picked up the welfare petition. "The jurisdictional argument is correct. This filing has no legal standing in this territory for a Montana resident. I'll have that argument formally documented and transmitted to the governor's office within the hour." He looked at Clara. "But I need you to understand that the governor's response won't be instantaneous. We're talking days, possibly a week. In that window, Vale can still use the threat of the Pitts hearing to create uncertainty. He'll use it against the Valley families," Clara said. "He'll tell the Phelps and the others that the legal situation in the county is unstable and that selling now is safer than waiting." "Yes," Braddock said. Then we need to be in front of those families before he is, Wyatt said. We also need something else, Clara said. She'd been thinking about this since the night before, from the angle she kept returning to the thing that was underneath everything Richard was doing, the foundation of the whole construction. The succession document, the forged one for the North Ridge parcels. Where is it physically? Braddock looked at her carefully. According to the court filing that used it, it was submitted to the Territorial Land Commission Records Office in the county seat. If that document could be examined by an independent party, a qualified document examiner before Vale's meridian filing is heard and found to be forged, his entire land claim collapses, Clara said. The transfer hold becomes a transfer denial. The right-of-way doesn't exist. Every offer letter from Meridian Land Associates becomes evidence of a fraud scheme rather than a business proposition. That's correct, Braddock said. How quickly can a document examiner be brought in? Braddock studied her. There's a man in the county seat who does this work for the courts. I've used him before. He's careful, and he's honest. He paused. If I wire him this morning with a formal request. Wire him, Clara said. Clara, Wyatt started. Wire him, she said again. Not impatiently, just with the certainty of someone who has seen the full shape of the problem and knows where the center of it is. Everything else we're doing, the jurisdictional argument, the governor's correspondence, the community standing together, all of it buys time. And time is good. But the forged document is the thing that ends this. If we can prove forgery, Richard has no land claim, no legal leverage, and a criminal exposure that makes everything else he's doing significantly more dangerous for him personally. She looked at Braddock. He's smart enough to know that. Which means if he finds out an examiner is being brought in, he'll move to block it. So we move first, Braddock said. Before he knows we're moving, Clara said. Braddock reached for his telegraph pad. They spent the morning covering ground. Wyatt and Clara split the valley visits because there wasn't time to do them together. Wyatt took the Harmon Ranch and two of the smaller operations to the south, while Clara rode to the Phelps with Margaret Harmon's daughter-in-law, who had offered to come along in a way that made it clear the offer was not optional. Nora Phelps had already heard about the filings. Information moved fast in a valley where everyone's livelihood was connected to the same threat. And by the time Clara arrived, Nora had a pot of coffee on, and the expression of a woman who had made some decisions overnight. He sent someone yesterday afternoon, Nora said. Not Tilden, a different man, friendlier. He sat at this table and told Tom that the legal situation in the county was going to make things very complicated for small operations over the next few months, and that the offer from Meridian was a way to step out of the complication before it landed. What did Tom say? Clara asked. Tom said he'd think about it. Nora looked at Clara steadily. Then I came in from outside and Tom told me what the man had said, and I told Tom what I thought about it, and Tom stopped thinking about it. She paused. What do you need from us? Clara told her about the document examiner, about the forged succession claim, about what it would mean if the forgery could be proven before Vale's Meridian filing was heard. Nora listened without interrupting. How can we help? She asked when Clara finished. Stay the course, Clara said. Don't sign anything. Don't meet with anyone from Meridian or any Boston firm without Braddock present. And, she stopped. What Nora said. If you have anything in writing from Meridian, or from Vale's representatives, offer letters, correspondence, any notes from conversations, I need copies of all of it. Documented proof of the outreach campaign helps establish the coordinated nature of what he's doing. She looked at Nora. It's not just a land grab if he sent forged documents to a court and simultaneously orchestrated a campaign to purchase properties below their actual value. That's fraud on multiple levels. That's the kind of thing a territorial court takes seriously even when a judge has been compromised. Nora got up, went to the kitchen shelf and came back with a small stack of papers. Every letter, she said. Every note. I kept them all because something felt wrong from the beginning, and I've lived long enough to know that when something feels wrong, you keep the evidence. Clara took the papers. Thank you, she said. Win first, Nora said. By midday, Clara had collected correspondence from 3 Valley families. Wyatt had collected 2 more. They met back at the ranch with a stack of documentation that laid out on the kitchen table, told the story of a coordinated operation. Dates, amounts, identical language across letters from supposedly different representatives, a pattern so clear that you didn't need to be a lawyer to see it. Wyatt looked at the table. This is good, he said. This is really good. It's enough to show coordination, Clara said, combined with the succession forgery if the examiner confirms it. She stopped. A horse on the road. Not fast this time. Deliberate. Wyatt was at the window. Vale, he said. Alone. Clara blinked. Alone? No Tilden, no third man, just him. That was wrong. Richard did not go anywhere without support. He did not approach uncertain situations without calculated backup. A lone Richard Vale riding up to the ranch meant something had changed or something was being staged. Don't let him in, Clara said immediately. I wasn't going to, Wyatt said. They went to the porch. Richard Vale looked different from yesterday. Not disheveled. Richard never looked disheveled, but something in his presentation had changed. The composed pleasantness was still in place, but it was sitting on something else now, something that might have been urgency if you knew how to read him past the surface. Clara knew how to read him past the surface. I'd like to speak with you, he said, to both of them. Not just to Clara, not performing the marital claim, to both of them, which was itself a change. Speak, Wyatt said from the porch. Richard looked at him, then at Clara, then back at Wyatt. I'd prefer porch or nothing, Wyatt said. A pause. All right. Richard dismounted and tied his horse to the post, not handing the reins to someone else, because there was no one else, which Clara kept noting with the specific alertness of a person who understands that a pattern breaking means something. He came to the foot of the porch steps and looked up at them. I want to discuss terms, he said. Clara said, terms for what? Resolution, Richard said. A mutual resolution that addresses the legitimate interests of all parties. There's nothing mutual about what you've been doing, Clara said. You filed a welfare petition using my father's name without telling me. You had someone break into Ed Garrity's office. You sent representatives to pressure Valley families with forged land claims underneath their offer letters. She paused. What terms are you actually offering? Something moved across Richard's face, and Clara saw it, the thing she had never seen before in all the months she'd spent trying to read him. Not anger, not calculation, not the smoothed-over pleasantness that covered everything. Worry. Richard Vale was worried. She kept her face still. The welfare petition can be withdrawn, he said. The Meridian inquiry can be suspended pending a new review. He looked at her directly. What I need is for certain information to remain private. Information that was recently provided to a territorial law officer that could be characterized as testimony. Her written account. The 3 pages in Braddock's file naming Harlan Moss describing the conversation about the succession document. He knew about it, which meant he had someone in Braddock's office, or someone Braddock had spoken to. You want me to recant, Clara said. I want this to reach an accommodation, Richard said. I'm prepared to be generous. Your father's debts fully resolved. The welfare petition withdrawn. The Meridian inquiries in this valley concluded with no further action. He paused. You keep your life here, Miss Whitmore. I stop making it complicated. The silence after that was very long. Wyatt did not speak. He was looking at Clara the way he always looked at her in moments that mattered, with full attention and not a single ounce of pressure. Clara looked at Richard Vale. She looked at the man who had stood in her parents' parlor and told her in his pleasant voice that she did not understand what he was offering. She looked at the man who had filed a welfare petition with her father's signature before he'd even finished the theater of trying to talk to her. She looked at the man who had orchestrated a land fraud scheme in Wyoming 4 years ago and gotten away with it because no one had put the pieces together fast enough. He was offering her the thing she had wanted most 4 months ago. An end to it. A cost that looked like freedom. "No," she said. Richard's face went very still. "The testimony stands," she said. "The documentation goes to the Territorial Commission. The document examiner looks at the succession claim, and you withdraw everything, every petition, every meridian filing, every offer letter in this valley on your own, without conditions, because you're going to have to withdraw it anyway when the examiner confirms what we already know." "You're making a significant mistake," Richard said. It came out differently from the last time he'd said it. Less certain, more brittle. "You told me that once before," Clara said. "In my parents' parlor. You said I didn't understand what you were offering. You were right that I didn't understand it. I thought you were offering a marriage. You were offering a transaction, and I was the commodity." She held his gaze. "I understand everything you're offering now, and my answer is the same as it was then." Richard stood at the foot of the porch steps and looked at her for a long moment. She had watched him do this before this particular stillness, and she knew what it meant. It was the moment he recalculated, filed the current approach away, and reached for the next one. But this time, whatever he reached for, he didn't say it out loud. He untied his horse. He mounted. He looked at Wyatt one last time, and what was in his face was not the confident assessment of yesterday. It was something a great deal more like the look of a man who has realized the ground under him is not as solid as he thought it was. He rode away without another word. Wyatt watched him go. Then he said quietly, "He's going to move on the document examiner." "I know," Clara said. "How fast can Braddock get him here?" "I'll ride to Braddock now," Wyatt said, and was down the steps before she answered. What followed were the longest 36 hours of Clara Whitmore's life. Not the most frightening those had been the months in Boston, when the walls were closing and she hadn't yet found a direction to run. Not the most uncertain those had been the first days on the stagecoach, when she'd had nothing but a letter from a stranger and a destination she'd never seen. But the longest, because every hour had something in it that required a decision, and the decisions kept mattering. The document examiner arrived the next morning, a compact, methodical man named Seaver, who said almost nothing, and worked with the focused thoroughness of someone who had spent decades turning paper into evidence. He sat in Braddock's office with the succession document and his equipment, and asked not to be interrupted. During the hours Seaver worked, 3 more things happened. The first, a wire from the Territorial Governor's office, acknowledging receipt of Braddock's correspondence, and requesting a formal report on the compromised judicial authorization. Not action, yet acknowledgement. But acknowledgement from the right people was its own kind of progress. The second, Pauline Sayers from the dry goods store came to Braddock's office herself, uninvited and unannounced, and handed him a written account of the conversation she'd had with Richard Vail, including specific language he'd used about Clara's compromised judgment, signed and dated, offered as supporting material for whatever formal process was underway. She said she'd spoken with 3 other people in town who were prepared to do the same. Clara sat in Braddock's outer office when Pauline came in, and Pauline looked at her and said simply, "This community has been here a long time. We don't let strangers with money rewrite it." The third thing, Wyatt came in from the ranch around noon with a face that told Clara something had happened before he said a word. "Tom Phelps got another visit this morning," he said. "Different man this time. Told Tom that the document examiner was going to be paid to find fraud, whether fraud existed or not, and that the only people who would benefit from a prolonged legal fight were lawyers. He offered to increase the meridian number by 15% if Tom signed by end of day." "Tom didn't sign," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "Nora was standing behind the man the whole time," Wyatt said. "Tom didn't sign." Something crossed Clara's face that started as relief and became something fiercer. "He's throwing money because he's scared," she said. "He's scared," Wyatt confirmed. "Then Seaver's going to find what we think he'll find." "That's my read," Wyatt said. They waited. At 2 in the afternoon, Seaver came out of Braddock's office and sat down across from the sheriff's desk. He set the succession document on the desk. He set his written assessment beside it. "The document is not original," he said. He said it plainly, the way he apparently said everything without drama, just precision. "The paper stock is consistent with documents from the last 3 to 4 years, not documents from 12 years ago when the original transaction occurred. The ink composition is wrong for the period." The notarization seal is a reproduction. The original notary used a press with a slight irregularity in the bottom left margin that is absent from this seal. He tapped the assessment. "I've detailed all of this in writing. This document is a forgery." The room was completely silent. Braddock looked at the assessment, looked at the succession document, looked at Seaver. "Will you testify to this?" he asked. "It's my professional finding," Seaver said simply. "I always testify to my findings." Braddock picked up the assessment and held it for a moment. Then he looked at Clara. She was sitting very straight in her chair and her hands were folded in her lap, and she was not visibly doing anything. But Wyatt, who had spent 6 weeks learning the language of her face and her body, could see what was happening inside the stillness. The enormous, complicated wave of something that didn't have a clean name. That was partly relief, and partly the specific exhaustion of a person who has been fighting hard in one direction for a long time and suddenly finds that the direction is clear. Braddock stood. "I need to find Richard Vale," he said. He said it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been waiting a long time to say those specific words in that specific order. "Now." He found him at Millhaven's boarding house. Clara wasn't there for the arrest. Braddock had asked her to stay at the ranch, and for once she had agreed without argument, because some things were better witnessed from a distance, and because she understood that what Richard Vale needed most in the moment of his arrest was to not see her face. Not because she owed him that, but because she didn't want her last image of him to be an image of him watching her watch him fall. She found out how it went from Wyatt, who had ridden in behind Braddock at a distance. "He tried to buy Braddock," Wyatt said, "right there in the boarding house hallway. Told him there was money available for men who understood how the territory was going to develop." "What did Braddock say?" Clara asked. Wyatt looked at her with something warm in his expression. "He said, 'Sir, I'm arresting you for land fraud, suborning a judicial officer, and breaking and entering a public records office. I don't have time to discuss the territory's development.'" Clara closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, Wyatt was still looking at her. "Tilden," she asked, "Braddock has deputies. They picked him up at Millhaven's at the same time." He paused. "Harlan Moss, the attorney in Boston, his name and the connection to the succession document are in the formal complaint that goes to the territorial governor tonight. Braddock says that's a federal matter at that point." "My father," Clara said. Wyatt was quiet. "He signed the welfare petition," she said. "That's not nothing." "No," Wyatt said. "It's not nothing." She looked at her hands. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to know tonight," Wyatt said. "Is it enough that I'm—" She stopped. "Is it enough that I understand why he did it without it being all right that he did it?" Wyatt considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think that's usually how it works with family," he said. "Understanding the why doesn't make it all right. It just makes it more complicated than all right or not all right." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "When your wife died," she said carefully, "was there anything you couldn't forgive anyone?" He absorbed the question. "There was a doctor," he said finally. "He came 2 days late. He stopped. "I understood why. The weather, the distances, the things that go wrong in ways nobody controls." He paused. "I still haven't entirely forgiven him. I'm not sure I'm supposed to yet." "Does that bother you?" Clara asked. "Sometimes," he said. "Less than it used to." They sat together in the kitchen in the specific quiet of the evening after a very long day, and the lamps burned low, and outside, the Montana night was enormous and indifferent and beautiful, in the way that large things are beautiful, not because they care about you, but because they contain you, and sometimes being contained is its own kind of comfort. "It's over," Clara said, not a question, letting herself say the words. The worst of it, Wyatt said. There's still the commission hearing, still the governor's process on Pitts, still things to document and file and testify to. He looked at her. But the part where you have to be afraid of what's coming around the next corner, that part's done. Clara looked at her hands. They were completely still. She had not been the woman who arrived terrified for some time now. She understood that, in the abstract, the way you understand things that have changed while you were busy surviving them. But sitting in this kitchen in this quiet, she let herself understand it fully for the first time. The frightened woman from the stagecoach was gone. Someone else had been built in her place piece by piece in the mornings learning fence posts, and the evenings on the porch, and the nights in Braddock's office writing the truth down on paper and riding through the dark with important documents under her arm and standing on a porch refusing to move, built with her own hands. And with the presence of a man who had never not once tried to build her into something she wasn't. "Wyatt," she said. He looked at her, and she understood that the thing she had been not saying for weeks, the thing that was too large for the middle of a crisis, too real for a moment borrowed from something else, was ready to be said now. Not as something dramatic, not with ceremony, just as the true thing it was between two people who had earned the right to say it. "Thank you," she said, "for the lock on the door, for the key you didn't keep a copy of, for standing beside me and not in front of me." She stopped. "For being exactly what you said you were in the letter." Wyatt looked at her for a long, steady moment. "You did this," he said. "I want you to know that. Everything that happened in this county in the past 2 weeks, you drove it, not me." "We drove it," she said. He considered that. "We drove it," he agreed. And then, because some things are better said slowly, and some things are better said now, he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers and left it there and did not say anything else. Because he didn't need to. Because the kitchen was warm and the danger was over and the Montana night was doing what it always did, enormous and continuing. And inside that night were two people who had found each other on the far side of everything they'd survived. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Wyatt's hand stayed over hers for a long time that night. Neither of them moved to make it more than it was, and neither of them moved to make it less. It was the kind of moment that exists in the space between what has been and what is coming, and both of them understood without saying so, that rushing it would ruin it, that the thing growing between them deserved the same patience Wyatt had offered her from the very first day, the same unhurried respect that had made her trust him before she'd had any rational reason to. Eventually, the lamp burned lower, and Clara said goodnight and went upstairs, and she lay in the dark holding the key to her door, and understood that she hadn't locked it in 4 nights. She hadn't noticed until now. She lay there with that fact and let it mean what it meant. The days that followed Richard Vale's arrest moved with a different quality than the days before. It not slow exactly because there was still a great deal to do, but purposeful in a way that felt clean rather than urgent. The difference between running toward something and running from it, which Clara was beginning to understand, was one of the most important differences a life could contain. Braddock's formal complaint reached the territorial governor's office on a Thursday. By Saturday, a response had come back authorizing a full territorial review of Judge Ambrose Pitts's conduct and suspending his judicial authority pending that review. It was not a dramatic announcement. It did not arrive with ceremony. It was a wire 3 sentences long that Braddock read to Clara and Wyatt in his office with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had placed a very specific bet a long time ago and was watching it pay. "Pitts will lawyer up," Braddock said. "So will Vale. This goes to a territorial court now, possibly federal. It could take months to fully resolve." "But the land transfer is blocked," Clara said. "Permanently in my assessment," Braddock said. "The succession document is proven fraudulent. Without it, Vale has no claim on the North Ridge parcels. Without the North Ridge, there's no right-of-way. Without the right-of-way, Meridian Land Associates has no reason to exist in this county." He set down the wire. "The families in this valley are safe." Clara thought about Nora Phelps saying when first. "I need to tell the Phelps," she said. "I'll ride with you," Wyatt said. Nora Phelps opened the door before they knocked. It seemed to be a habit of the women in this valley. Clara had noticed this readiness, this awareness of what was coming before it arrived, and took one look at their faces and said, "It's done." "It's done," Clara said. Nora put her hand over her mouth for exactly 2 seconds. Then she lowered it and said with the particular composure of a woman who had been holding herself together for a very long time and was choosing to continue doing so even now, "Come inside. I'll put coffee on." Tom was at the table, and he stood when they came in, and Wyatt shook his hand, and they sat together, and Clara explained the full shape of it. The forgery confirmed the transfer blocked the governor's review of Pittsvale in custody pending a territorial hearing. She was careful to be accurate rather than celebratory, because the legal process was real, and it would take time, and there were things yet to be resolved. But Tom Phelps, who had spent the past 2 weeks with the look of a man carrying something too heavy for his frame, set his coffee cup down and exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath underwater and had finally broken the surface. "It's really over," he said. "The worst of it," Wyatt said. The same thing he had said to Clara the night before. Tom looked at Clara. "You did this." "We did this," Clara said. "Every family in this valley who held their ground, Garrity, Braddock, Pauline Sayers walking into the sheriff's office with a signed statement." She paused. "I just knew where the weak points were." "You knew where the weak points were," Nora said, "because you'd been living inside his operation for long enough to understand it. That's not nothing, that's the whole thing." Clara looked at her. "You said win first," Clara said. "So I did." Nora smiled a full, real smile that rearranged her whole face into something younger than the past weeks had allowed her to be. "Yes," she said. "You did." The community gathering happened 3 days later, not because anyone formally organized it, but because small communities have their own momentum, their own social gravity. And after something significant has been survived together, the people involved tend to find themselves in the same place, at the same time, without having planned it in advance. It happened at the Harmon Ranch because Margaret Harmon's table was the largest in the valley, and she had never in living memory turned away a person who needed feeding. Clara sat between Wyatt and Pauline Sayers, and ate the best meal she'd had since leaving Boston. Actually better than anything in Boston, she thought, because this food had been made by people who were feeding each other after something hard, and that intention made it taste like something more than ingredients. Margaret stood up at the end of the meal and said without preamble, "I want to say something about Clara Whitmore." The table went quiet. Clara felt color move into her face. When she came off that stagecoach 3 weeks ago, Margaret said, she was frightened. Anyone who was there could see it. But what frightened people don't always do is walk straight into the thing that's frightening them and start taking it apart piece by piece. She looked down the table at Clara. This woman knew what we were dealing with before any of us did. She knew it because she'd survived it, and instead of using that survival to protect only herself, she used it to protect this whole valley. She paused. That's character, and this community is better for having her in it. Several people around the table made sounds of agreement. Clara said, "The valley protected itself. I just understood the map." "You drew the map," Davis Harmon said from across the table. It was one of the longest sentences he'd produced in 3 weeks, and it landed with the specific weight of words from someone who didn't spend them carelessly. Clara didn't know what to say to that. She looked at her plate. Wyatt beside her said nothing, but his shoulder was touching hers, and he didn't move it, and in the particular language they had developed over 3 weeks of living alongside each other, that was its own kind of statement. Walking back to the wagon after the gathering in the cool dark of a Montana evening, Wyatt said, "There's something I need to ask you." Clara looked at him. "You don't have to stay," he said. She stopped walking. He stopped too, turning to face her, and his expression was the most unguarded she had seen it, not vulnerable exactly because Wyatt Callahan was not a man who did vulnerable in the conventional way, but open in a way that cost him something. "The reason you came here was to be safe," he said. "That was the need, and the need is met. Vale is in custody. The valley is secure. Your name is clear. He looked at her steadily. You're a free woman, Clara. Free in a way you've never been before. That means you can go anywhere, do anything. He paused. I didn't want you to stay because you thought you had to, or because leaving seemed complicated, or because you were grateful. He looked at her with the particular direct honesty that she had come to understand was not just his communication style, but his whole orientation toward life. I want you to stay because you want to be here. The night was very quiet around them. Clara looked at this man, this quiet, careful, steady man, who had put a lock on a door and not kept a copy of the key, who had stood beside her on a porch and not in front of her, who had worked alongside her when she was wrong and not pointed at it, who had said, "We drove it without hesitation," who had just told her she was free and could go anywhere and meant every word of it. She looked at him for a long moment. "Wyatt," she said. "Where would I go?" He was quiet. "I don't mean that the way it sounds," she said. "I don't mean there's nowhere else. I mean—" She stopped finding the words she wanted, the precise ones. 3 weeks ago, I came here looking for safety. I thought safety was the absence of Richard Vale. I thought it was a locked door and enough distance. She met his eyes. But safety isn't a location. I understand that now. Safety is being with someone who doesn't require you to be smaller than you are, who looks at you in a crisis and asks, "How do you want to handle this?" instead of handling it for you. She paused. That's not something I can find somewhere else. That's you. That's specifically, particularly only you. Wyatt looked at her for a moment that lasted long enough for the night wind to move through the grass twice. Then he said very quietly, I fell in love with you somewhere around day 4, when you corrected the fence post. Clara felt something open up in her chest so completely that it almost hurt. Day 4, she said. You got it wrong, and you fixed it without being asked, and you didn't apologize for getting it wrong, he said. I thought that's who she is. That's the actual person. He paused. I've been trying to go slow because I didn't want you to feel any version of pressured. Not again. I know, she said. I noticed. Was it the right call? She thought about it, genuinely considered it. Yes, she said. I needed the time. I needed to know that the feeling I was having wasn't gratitude, and wasn't relief, and wasn't just the difference between you and Richard making you seem better than you are. She looked at him steadily. You're not better by comparison, Wyatt. You're good on your own terms. That took me a little while to learn to see. He looked at her. And then, because some things had waited long enough, and the waiting had served its purpose and was now simply waiting, he reached out and tucked a piece of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that was entirely unlike the gentleness of a man being careful. It was the gentleness of a man who meant it, which is an entirely different thing. And he said, Stay. I'm staying, she said. And she kissed him first, because she was not a woman who waited anymore for someone else to decide when things could begin. Down. The legal proceedings against Richard Vale moved through the territorial court system with the unhurried thoroughness of a process that had for once all the evidence it needed. Seaver's forgery assessment was entered into the formal record. Clara's written testimony was submitted and affirmed. The correspondence from Meridian Land Associates collected from every Valley family who'd received it was cataloged and presented as evidence of coordinated fraud. Harlan Moss, Richard's attorney in Boston, was named in a federal inquiry that reached Boston 3 weeks after Vale's arrest. It was a small item in the Boston papers. Clara found out about it from a letter Pauline Sayers received from a cousin. And reading the description of Moss's offices being visited by federal marshals, Clara felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just a kind of quiet finality, like a door closing on a room she didn't need to enter anymore. Her father wrote a letter. It arrived 6 weeks after the arrest, forwarded through Pauline's cousin in the complicated relay that served as Clara's connection to her former life. It was 2 pages in her father's careful handwriting, and it was the most honest thing he had ever written to her, which made it both easier and harder to read than everything that had come before it. He said he had been wrong. He said he had been afraid, and that fear had made him sell his daughter's future for debt relief. And he said he understood if she could not forgive that. He said Richard's people had approached him about the welfare petition, and he had signed it because they told him it was the only way to ensure her safety, and he had been too frightened and too foolish to ask the right questions. He said he had received a visit from a federal marshal asking about the petition, and in the course of that conversation had understood for the first time the full scope of what Richard Vail had been doing in Montana and Wyoming before that in 3 other states, and what he, Arthur Whitmore, had allowed himself to be used for. He did not ask her to come home. He said her mother missed her. He said he hoped she was well. He said, "Your mother tells me you found someone worthy of you. I hope that is true. I hope he knows what he has." Clara read the letter, sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with her coffee going cold beside her, and she cried, which surprised her. Not the sad kind of crying, not the relieved kind, but the specific kind that comes when something you've been carrying for a long time finally gets set down, and you feel for the first time how heavy it actually was. Wyatt came in from outside and saw her face. He sat down across from her. He didn't ask. She handed him the letter. He read it slowly. Set it down. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to write back," she said. "I want to tell him I'm well. I want to tell him I'm not coming home, but that I'm not. I don't want him to spend the rest of his life not knowing whether I'm all right." "What about the rest of it?" Wyatt asked. "The petition, the signing." Clara looked at the letter. "I understand it," she said. "I don't think I've forgiven it yet, but I understand it." She looked at Wyatt. "You told me that's usually how it works with family." "I did," he said. "You were right," she said. "Probably." He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. "Write the letter," he said. "Say what's true. The rest takes the time it takes." She wrote the letter that afternoon. 3 pages. Honest in the way she had learned to be honest, not brutal, not withholding, but real. She told her father she was well. She told him about the ranch, about Scout, the mare, about the fence posts she'd learned to set correctly, and the garden she was planning for spring. She told him Wyatt was a good man, the specific kind of good that wasn't about absence of flaw, but about presence of character, and that she had not felt like someone's possession since she arrived. She did not say, "I forgive you." She said, "I understand more than I did. I'm working on the rest." She sealed it and gave it to Pauline to send through her cousin's relay. And then she went back to the ranch and the life she was building inside it. Spring arrived in Montana the way it always did in that part of the territory. Not gradually, but suddenly. One morning, the air different from the morning before, everything that had been dormant deciding at once that waiting was finished. Clara was outside early when it happened, before Wyatt was up, standing in the yard in the cold that was already softer than yesterday's cold, and she felt it, the shift, the specific opening of the world after a long closed season. She thought about the woman who had pressed herself against the window of a stagecoach 6 months ago and been terrified by a man in a coat that looked like someone else's coat. She thought about it the way you think about a story that happened to someone you know very well, close enough to be personal, distant enough to have perspective. That woman had survived. More than that, that woman had built something, had walked into a crisis she didn't cause, and mapped its structure, and found its weak points, and held her ground, and told the truth, until the truth became something unmovable, that even a man with Richard Vail's money and reach couldn't dismantle. Clara did not consider herself brave in retrospect. She considered herself someone who had run out of options except forward. But she was beginning to understand that was what courage usually was. The door opened behind her. Wyatt came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to her without a word, and stood beside her in the early light, and they were quiet together, in the way of people who have learned that quiet between them is not emptiness, but substance. "The garden," Clara said. "Today?" he asked. "Today," she said. "I want to start the garden today." "I'll dig the beds," he said. "I'll plant," she said. "That's how that works," he agreed. She looked at him sideways. Was that a joke? An observation? He said. It was a joke. It was a very small one, he admitted. She smiled. He watched her smile the way he always watched it, like it was something worth the attention, which she had stopped being surprised by, and started simply accepting as the thing it was, which was a form of love, expressed in the particular language of a man who didn't say more than he meant. 3 months after Richard Vale's arrest, the territorial court delivered its finding. Vale was convicted on 3 counts: land fraud, suborning a judicial officer, and conspiracy to defraud territorial property holders. The sentence was 7 years in a federal correctional institution. Harlan Moss in Boston received a separate federal conviction and a significant fine. Judge Ambrose Pitts was removed from the bench and permanently disbarred. The Northridge parcels were formally restored to federal territorial holdings, protected from private transfer pending territorial statehood review. Every family in the valley received official notification that all Meridian Land Associates claims were void, and no legal action arising from those claims would be pursued. Braddock delivered the news to Wyatt and Clara in person, riding out to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon, with the official documents in his saddlebag. He sat at their kitchen table. They thought of it that way now, without discussion, without ceremony. Just their kitchen table. And he drank the coffee Clara put in front of him, and he said, "It's done." Not, "It might be done," or "It looks like it's done." Just, "It's done." Clara sat down across from him. She thought she would feel something enormous. She had imagined this moment in the weeks since the arrest with an expectation of some overwhelming relief so large it would remake the room, or joy so complete she wouldn't know what to do with her hands. What she felt instead was quieter than that. It was the particular feeling of something that has been finished for some time finally becoming official. The actual ending had happened in stages: when Seaver confirmed the forgery, when Vale was arrested, when the governor suspended Pitts, when the Valley families were safe. The conviction was the paperwork at the end of something that was already in the ways that mattered already over. "Thank you," she said to Braddock, "for everything you did." "You did the work," he said. "I did the filing." "The filing mattered," Clara said. "The testimony mattered more," he said. "You gave me something to file." He finished his coffee, shook Wyatt's hand, nodded to Clara with the specific respect of a man who meant the nod, and rode back to town. Wyatt and Clara sat at the table with the documents between them, and the afternoon light coming through the window, and the ranch around them, doing the ordinary continuous work of being alive. "How do you feel?" Wyatt asked. Clara thought about it honestly. "Like I can plan things," she said. He looked at her. "I've been living 1 week at a time since I left Boston," she said. Looking ahead felt dangerous. It felt like assuming something that might be taken away. She looked at the documents. "I want to plan things. The garden, the fall planting, whether we should add another horse." She paused. "What it looks like to be here in 5 years, in 10. Wyatt was very still. "What does it look like?" he asked, quietly. She looked at him. "Full," she said. "It looks full. Not the same as it was the day I got here." She held his gaze. "Different people fill different spaces, I think. The loss you had, your wife, your son, I don't take up that space. I know that. But there's other space." She paused. "Space that's been empty for a long time. That you've been sitting in alone." Wyatt didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice was different, lower, the way it got when he said things that cost him something. "The day you arrived," he said, "I told myself I was just doing the practical thing. A man alone needs help with the ranch. A woman alone needs safety. It was sensible, reasonable." He looked at his hands. 2 days in, I knew that wasn't what was happening." "What was happening?" Clara asked. "I was waking up," he said simply. "I'd been going through the motions of living for 7 years, doing everything right, working hard, keeping the ranch going, being the kind of man people could count on." He looked up at her. "But I'd stopped expecting anything for myself. I'd stopped wanting things, personal things." He held her gaze. "You walked through my front door carrying a suitcase, and more fear than any person should carry alone. And inside a week I wanted things again. That's what you did, just by being here, just by being who you are." Clara felt the full weight of that move through her. Not the burden kind of weight. The solid kind. The kind that means something is real. "Wyatt Callahan," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "Are you telling me you want to marry me? Or are you telling me you already feel married?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved that particular, not quite smile that she had learned to watch for, and that always meant he was about to say something true. "I'm asking," he said, "to be clear." He reached into his shirt pocket and set something on the table between them. A small plain ring, gold simple, no ornamentation. "I had it made in town 3 weeks ago. I've been waiting for the right time." He looked at her. "I think the right time is when the paperwork is finished, and there's nothing else in the way, and it can just be the real question without anything else around it." Clara looked at the ring. She looked at the man who had put it on the table, and not on her finger, who was asking and not assuming, who had waited 3 weeks to find a moment that was only itself and nothing else. She picked up the ring. She held it for a moment. Then she held out her left hand. Wyatt took the ring from her palm. He put it on her finger. It fit. Of course it fit. She looked at it on her hand, and then she looked at him, and the thing in her chest was so large and so complete that she couldn't have named it and didn't try. "Yes," she said. Just that. Because it was the only word the moment needed. They married in the church at the end of Willow Creek's Main Street, the one with the fresh white paint that had looked newer than everything around it on the day Clara first arrived. Braddock stood on one side. Margaret Harmon stood on the other because Clara had no family present, and Margaret had decided with the same gentle implacability she brought to most things that this was not a situation requiring an invitation. The Phelps came, and the Harmons, and Pauline Sayers, and Ed Garrity, and Dolores Ashford, and Davis Harmon, who said exactly one word during the entire ceremony. Finally, at the moment the minister pronounced them married, which made everyone in the church laugh, including Clara, which was not the conventional emotional response to the moment, but was she thought exactly the right one. Nora Phelps hugged her afterward in the yard outside the church. "You won," Nora said. "We won," Clara said. "Same thing," Nora said, which was not actually the same argument Clara would have made, but she let it go because the afternoon was warm and the mountains were very blue against the sky, and her husband was 10 feet away, being congratulated by Braddock with the specific discomfort of a man who was not accustomed to being the center of attention, and was enduring it with dignity. And watching that made her feel something she didn't have a word for yet, but thought she might have the rest of her life to name. Chacho. Years passed. Not quickly and not slowly. Years pass at the speed they pass, which is the same speed for everyone, regardless of what is happening in them, and what happened in Wyatt and Clara Callahan's years was a great deal. The ranch grew. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the steady accumulation of work and good seasons, and the kind of decisions that look small individually and significant in retrospect. They added horses. They expanded the garden into something that produced more than they could use, which meant they gave the excess away, which meant there were people in the valley who ate better because of what grew beside the Callahan ranch house. Clara taught reading and arithmetic to the children of 4 families in the valley informally, at first at the kitchen table on Thursday afternoons, and then more formally as the settlement grew and the need became more consistent. She was not a trained teacher. She turned out to be a very good one, which surprised no one who had watched her learn to set fence posts in 2 days. She wrote to her father regularly. The letters were honest in the way she had learned to be honest, not withholding the hard things, not dwelling in them, either, just telling the truth at the temperature it actually existed. Her father wrote back. Her mother wrote occasionally shorter letters, more emotional, harder to read. Clara read them anyway. She did not go back to Boston. 2. She had considered it once in the 2nd year when her father's health had a difficult month. She had sat with Wyatt and talked about it genuinely, what it would mean, how long she might be gone, whether it was right. Wyatt had said, "Go if you need to. The ranch will be here." She had written a very long letter instead. Her father had recovered. She had thought about it afterward and understood that Boston was not a place she feared anymore. It was simply not where she lived. There was a difference. The letter that changed things came in the 8th year. It came from a woman named Helen Marsh in Wyoming, forwarded through 3 different people before it reached Clara, written in the handwriting of someone who had labored over every word with great care. Helen said she had read about the Vail case in a territorial newspaper years ago. She said she had been one of the Valley families in Wyoming who had lost land in the scheme 4 years before Montana, one of the cases where Vail had succeeded because no one had put the pieces together in time. She said she had spent years feeling ashamed as though losing to a fraud made her foolish rather than victimized. She said she had read about what Clara had done in Montana, the testimony, the document examiner, the community holding together. And she wanted Clara to know that reading it had changed something for her. She said, "You showed me that it wasn't my fault I lost. It was his fault he won. I couldn't see the difference until I saw what someone else did with the same situation. Thank you for doing what you did. It helped me, and I never even met you." Clara sat with that letter for a long time. She showed it to Wyatt that evening. He read it carefully the way he read everything and set it down. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking that the thing I knew about Richard Vail, the way he operated, the weak points, the specific structure of what he built. I used it once. Here." She paused. "And it turned out the same information could help someone in Wyoming who I've never met." She looked at him. "What if it could help other people? What if there are other valleys? Other families who are where this valley was 3 years ago and don't have someone who knows the map?" Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "What are you proposing?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I want to figure it out." What she figured out over the course of several months and a great deal of correspondence with Helen Marsh and Ed Garrity, and 2 lawyers in the county seat who were willing to help, was a network of information, an informal system by which women and families facing land fraud schemes in the territory could access documentation, guidance, legal referrals, and the accumulated knowledge of people who had been through it and come out the other side. It was not an institution. It was not a formal organization. It was what it had always been in Willow Creek, people sharing what they knew with people who needed it across a wider geography. Wyatt built an extra room on the house the year they started it. Clara asked him why. He said, "You're going to need somewhere for the correspondence." She looked at him. "You knew I was going to do this," she said. "I knew you were going to do something like this," he said. "You're not someone who stops at one valley." Clara looked at the room. "It might get complicated," she said. "It might," he said. "We're good at complicated." She looked at him. The man who had stood on a street in Willow Creek in front of a stagecoach and noticed that the woman stepping down wasn't shy. She was afraid and had understood the difference and had done the most important thing possible in that moment, had stepped back, made space, given her room to find her own footing, without anyone pushing her in a direction. The man who had put a lock on a door and not kept a copy of the key. The man who had said we drove it without hesitation and meant it. "We are," she said. "We're very good at complicated." Decades later, the porch off the back of the Callahan ranch house held 2 chairs that had been there so long the wood had shaped itself around the people who sat in them. Wyatt's hair had gone fully white, which suited him the way the gray had suited him before, with the kind of authenticity that comes from wearing your age rather than working against it. Clara's hands showed the years of ranch work and correspondence and teaching and everything else she'd done with them. And she looked at them sometimes and thought that was what useful hands were supposed to look like. They sat on that porch the way they had always sat together, saying things when there were things to say, and quiet when there weren't, and never confusing the quiet with emptiness. The valley was different now, fuller, more houses. A school building that Clara had helped establish 12 years ago and still occasionally taught in when the teacher was ill. a small telegraph office that had gone in 6 years after Vale's conviction, connecting them to the rest of the territory in ways that made some things easier and some things more complicated. Richard Vale had served his 7 years and been released. Clara knew this because Braddock had told her, and because she had made herself know it, rather than being surprised by it someday. She did not think about him often. When she did, she thought about him the way you think about weather that caused damage once, with the memory of what it cost, and the clear-eyed understanding that it was over and had been over for a long time. She did not think about him tonight. Tonight, she was thinking about a letter she'd received last week from a woman in Oregon who had used the information network to challenge a fraudulent mining claim on her family's land, and won, and who had written to say thank you, and who had signed the letter with a name Clara didn't recognize, attached to a place she'd never been. The network had reached Oregon. She hadn't known that. Wyatt had laughed when she told him the full, genuine laugh she had been collecting for years, now noting every instance, storing them with the same care she'd once stored the key to her door. "You're surprised," he'd said. "A little," she'd said. "You shouldn't be," he'd said. "You're not someone who stops at one valley. I told you that 20 years ago." She'd looked at him then, the way she looked at him now, with the specific fullness of a person who has been known by someone for a long time, deeply and truly known, and who understands that this is not a small thing, is not something that simply happens, but is something that is built carefully and continuously by two people who both decide every day to keep building. Wyatt looked at her in the evening light. "Still thinking about Oregon," he said. "A little," she said. "Good," he said. "You should write back." "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. They sat in the quiet that was not empty. The mountains did what they always did, remained enormous and indifferent and beautiful, containing everything below them, without effort, without opinion, without any requirement that the people inside them be anything other than what they were. Clara Whitmore had arrived in this valley terrified, holding a suitcase in hands that would not stop shaking, running from a life that had tried to make her into something she could not be. She had stayed. She had built. She had loved a man who understood that love was not possession, and who had shown her that safety was not a locked room, but an open hand, and she had taken that hand and held it, and never let it go. The woman who arrived running had become the woman this valley called its own. And the home she had found at the end of a 1,000-mile road was not the ranch house, and not the Montana mountains, and not the wide sky above them. It was this. The hand in hers. The quiet between two people who had earned it. The life they had chosen every single day with open hands and clear eyes, and the bone-deep certainty that the best thing a person could do with the love they were given was not to hold it close and protect it from loss, but to let it grow until it was larger than the two of them, until it reached Oregon, until it became something that helped people. They would never meet, find their way out of the dark. That was what Clara Callahan knew at the end of everything, sitting on a porch with the man she had chosen and who had chosen her back. That love given freely in a world that had taught you to expect it to cost you everything was the most radical and the most unbreakable thing a human being could build. And she had built it, and it had held, and it would keep holding long after the porch and the chairs, and even the mountains themselves had changed into something new, because the truth of what two people build together when they build it right does not end with them. It goes forward, into the world, into Oregon, into every valley that has not yet found its way to morning. And the woman who arrived terrified, who pressed herself against the window of a stagecoach because a stranger's coat looked wrong, became proof of the one thing she had stopped believing before she ever stepped off that stage. That there are places in this world, and people in this world, where you are not required to be afraid anymore. And that finding them is worth every mile of the road it takes to get there.